What if Alexander the Great lived 30 years longer? How would he change the course of history? Before we begin tonight's journey through time, tell me, where are you listening from? And how old are you? Alexander the Great died at just 32, his dreams unfinished. Tonight, we'll imagine what the world might have become if he had lived 30 more years. The night air in Babylon hangs thick and heavy, carrying the scent of the Euphrates and the perfumes of 1,000 gardens. It is June 323 BCE, and in a palace chamber decorated with both Macedonian trophies and Persian splendor, a young man lies dying. He is 32 years old, and he has conquered the known world. His name echoes from the Mediterranean to India, from the frozen steppes of Scythia to the burning sands of Egypt. He is Alexander, called the Great, King of Macedon, Pharaoh of Egypt, King of Kings of Persia, and Lord of an empire larger than any the world has ever seen. For days he has burned with fever, his legendary body betrayed by something his sword cannot fight. His generals crowd around, these hard men who have marched 10,000 miles at his side, who have seen him charge into battle like a god made flesh, who have watched him weep over the body of his friend Hephaestion. Now they watch him die, and in their eyes you can see not just grief but calculation. Because when Alexander dies, the greatest empire in history will have no clear successor. And these men know what must follow: war, endless, brutal war, as they tear apart what he built in the desperate scramble for pieces of his glory. But what if the fever broke? What if the young king, possessed of a constitution as strong as his will, survived this illness as he had survived countless wounds in battle? What if Alexander the Great, instead of dying at 32 with the world half conquered and his ambitions unfulfilled, lived another 30 years? What if he reached the age of 62, ruling his empire through middle age into the beginning of old age? What kind of world would such a man create? What would he attempt that death prevented? And how would the long shadow of such a reign stretch across the centuries to touch our own world today? This is not idle fantasy. History balances on such moments, on the turning of a fever, on the success or failure of a physician's treatment, on the body's mysterious choice to fight or surrender. Alexander's death in Babylon was unexpected, controversial, possibly the result of poison, possibly disease, possibly the cumulative effect of wounds and exhaustion. But it was not inevitable. Men have survived worse, and if he had survived, every calculation changes. The wars of the successors, those decades of conflict that carved his empire into pieces, never happen. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from that chaos, Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria, and Antigonid Macedon, never exist in the forms we know. Rome's rise to dominance faces obstacles that in our timeline never materialized. The entire trajectory of Western and Near Eastern history pivots on a different axis. Tonight we stand at that crossroads. We watch as the fever burns, as the physicians work, as the generals wait, and then we follow the path not taken, the road where Alexander lives, where his ambitions continue to unfold, where the world conqueror has 3 more decades to reshape the earth. We will see campaigns that never happened, cities that were never built, conflicts that never occurred. We will watch as the young conqueror becomes a middle-aged administrator, as raw ambition evolves into something more complex and perhaps more dangerous. We will trace the butterfly effects of this altered history as they spread across centuries, changing languages, religions, empires, ultimately reaching into our present moment. The story is vast, the implications staggering, and the exercise is not merely academic. By exploring this alternate path, we come to understand how contingent our own history is, how much depends on individual lives and random chance. We discover that the world we know, which seems so solid and inevitable, is actually one possibility among many, shaped by accidents of biology and circumstance. And in that discovery lies both humility and wonder. So let us begin. Let us return to Babylon in that pivotal summer when the fate of empires hung on the breath of one man. Let us watch as history forks, As one possibility fades and another grows bright, the desert stars shine over Mesopotamia, indifferent to human ambition. But the humans below are not indifferent. They are about to discover whether their king is mortal after all, or whether the legend can continue. The night is long, the story is vast, and 3 decades of alternate history await us. Alexander the Man. Understanding the Conqueror. To understand what Alexander might have done with 30 additional years, we must first understand who he was. Not the legend, not the myth, but the actual human being who conquered the Persian Empire before his 33rd birthday. This is more difficult than it seems. Alexander is one of history's most documented, yet most mysterious figures. We have multiple ancient biographies, countless anecdotes, archaeological evidence from his cities, and yet the man himself remains elusive, obscured by centuries of myth-making and propaganda. What we do know paints a portrait of extraordinary complexity. Alexander was brilliant, that much is certain. His military genius is undeniable. At the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela, at the Hydaspes, he demonstrated tactical innovation and strategic vision that professional soldiers study to this day. He understood combined arms warfare before the concept had a name, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and siege equipment with precision. He grasped logistics, that most unglamorous but essential aspect of campaigning, maintaining supply lines across vast distances. He possessed the psychological insight to know when to offer mercy and when to employ terror, when to adopt local customs and when to impose Macedonian will. But genius alone does not explain Alexander. He was also driven by something deeper, more personal, more dangerous. Ambition, yes, but ambition of a peculiar kind. He did not merely want power or wealth, though he had both in abundance. He wanted glory, specifically glory that would surpass his father Philip's achievements and rival the heroes of Greek mythology. He slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself. He believed he was descended from Achilles through his mother Olympias, and from Heracles through his father Philip. These were not merely dynastic claims, but articles of faith that shaped his self-understanding. This mythological self-conception drove him to extraordinary risks. At the Granicus, against his general's advice, he personally led the cavalry charge across a defended river, nearly dying in the process. At the siege of Tyre, he insisted on being first onto the enemy walls. In India, fighting the Malians, he jumped down into an enemy city with only 3 companions, was surrounded and nearly killed, suffered wounds that would plague him for the rest of his life. These were not the actions of a careful commander, but of a man who needed to prove himself worthy of the heroes he emulated. The influence of his education under Aristotle cannot be overstated. From the philosopher, Alexander absorbed Greek cultural superiority, the idea that Hellenic civilization represented the highest achievement of humanity, but he also learned to observe, to categorize, to think systematically. During his campaigns, he sent back botanical and zoological specimens to Aristotle, contributed to geographic knowledge, showed genuine intellectual curiosity about the lands he conquered. He was not simply a destroyer but a student of the world, trying to understand what he was absorbing into his empire, his relationship with his companions. The heteroi who formed his inner circle was intense and complicated. These were men he had grown up with, trained with, fought alongside. They loved him, feared him, followed him to the ends of the earth, and increasingly resented him. Hephaestion, his closest friend and probable lover, understood him best and was loyal unto death. Ptolemy, brilliant and ambitious, would eventually betray the unity of empire to carve out Egypt for himself. Perdiccas, Craterus, Seleucus, Antigonus, each had his own relationship with Alexander, each his own ambitions and resentments. As the campaigns progressed and Alexander began adopting Persian customs, those relationships strained. When he started wearing Persian dress, demanding proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostration before the king, marrying Roxana and other Persian princesses, his Macedonian companions felt betrayed. They had conquered Persia to loot it, not to become Persian. Alexander's vision of a fused Greco-Persian civilization, with himself as divine ruler bridging both worlds, struck them as a betrayal of Macedonian values and their own importance. This tension came to a head at various points. At the Hyphasis River in India, his army simply refused to march further. They were exhausted, far from home, and unwilling to continue into unknown lands for what seemed like Alexander's insatiable ambition. He raged, sulked in his tent for days, but ultimately had to accept their refusal. It was perhaps the only time anyone successfully said no to Alexander, and it traumatized him. Later, at a drunken banquet in Maracanda, he killed Clytus, one of his oldest companions, in a fit of rage after Clytus criticized his Persian pretensions. Alexander's remorse was extreme. He lay for days wishing for death, but the act revealed the darkness in him, the volcanic temper that could destroy what he loved. His drinking was legendary and problematic. The Macedonian culture celebrated heavy drinking, symposia where men would drink unmixed wine and compete in consumption. Alexander participated enthusiastically, and some sources suggest his final illness may have been triggered by a particularly heavy drinking session. Whether alcoholic in the modern clinical sense is debatable with ancient evidence, but clearly his relationship with alcohol was unhealthy and would grow more so under the pressures of ruling a vast empire. His sexuality, like much about him, is debated, but likely followed the Greek aristocratic pattern of bisexuality. Hephaestion was almost certainly his lover. There were rumors of a relationship with the Persian eunuch Bagoas. He married multiple times, to Roxana, to Statera, daughter of Darius III, to Parysatis, primarily for political reasons, though he may have developed genuine affection for Roxana. The marriages produced children, though only one son, Alexander IV, survived him in our timeline, and that child was murdered by rivals before reaching adulthood. What drove him eastward, ever eastward, past the boundaries of the known world? Partly it was the logic of conquest. Having defeated Darius III, having claimed the Persian throne, he needed to control all Persian territories to legitimate his rule. The eastern satrapies, Bactria and Sogdiana, resisted, so he had to conquer them. India beckoned beyond, wealthy and mysterious. But it was more than strategic necessity. Alexander seems to have believed he could conquer the entire world, that somewhere there was an ocean that marked Earth's boundary, and if he could just reach it, his conquest would be complete and he could rest. When he reached the Indian Ocean and learned it was not the world-encircling ocean, but merely another sea with lands beyond, he was devastated. This is crucial for understanding what he might do with 30 additional years. He was not satisfied with what he had conquered. He never would be satisfied. There was always another horizon, another challenge, another people to subjugate and add to his empire. If he lived, he would campaign. The question is not whether, but where and with what consequences. His administrative abilities were real, but underdeveloped. He was fundamentally a warrior king, more comfortable on campaign than in a palace. The governmental structures he established were largely inherited from Persia, the satrapy system with Macedonian and Greek officials replacing or supplementing Persian ones. He founded cities, dozens of them, mostly named Alexandria, as colonies for veterans and centers of Hellenistic culture. But the detailed work of governance bored him, and he delegated it whenever possible. Yet he had vision beyond mere conquest. The mass wedding at Susa, where he married 90 of his officers to Persian noblewomen and encouraged 10,000 of his soldiers to marry Asian women, was not just political theatre. It represented a genuine, if naive, belief that he could forge a new civilization, blending the best of Greek and Persian culture, with himself as divine ruler presiding over this synthesis. The experiment was unpopular with his Macedonians and largely failed even in his lifetime. After his death, most of those marriages were dissolved. But the vision reveals something important about Alexander's thinking. He saw himself not merely as conqueror, but as transformer, as a figure who would remake the world. This messianic self-conception, this belief in his divine mission, would only intensify if he lived longer. Already by 323 BCE, he was demanding recognition as a god, sending letters to Greek cities requiring divine honors. This was not entirely unprecedented in the ancient world, but it was radical for a Macedonian king. His father Philip had been deified after death, but Alexander wanted worship while living. How would age change him? At 32, he was still in many ways the impetuous youth who had crossed the Hellespont. His body was marked by wounds but still strong, his mind sharp, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. But no one stays young forever. If he lived to 62, he would experience the physical decline all humans face. The wounds that in our timeline killed him slowly, in this alternate history, merely weakened him gradually. The drinking would take its toll. The stress of ruling the largest empire in history, of managing fractious subordinates and conquered peoples, of planning ever more ambitious campaigns, would wear on even his extraordinary constitution. Middle age would bring different challenges. The wild risks of youth would have to be tempered. A king with heirs to consider cannot throw himself into battle with the same abandon. The administrative complexities that bored the young conqueror might engage the mature ruler more seriously. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Alexander would remain forever, the warrior seeking glory, aging and hardening but never truly growing. Achilles who lived past his prime into something darker and stranger. The sources suggest contradictory possibilities. Some ancient writers portray Alexander as increasingly paranoid in his final years, seeing plots everywhere, executing friends on suspicion. Others emphasize his generosity, his charisma, his ability to inspire devotion. Both are probably true. He was complex enough to contain contradictions, brilliant and cruel, generous and suspicious, visionary and reckless. 30 more years would amplify everything, both virtues and flaws, creating a figure even more mythological than the historical Alexander we know. As we turn to examine the empire he had built by 323 BCE and what he might do with it given more time, we must keep in mind this complex portrait. The man who survives Babylon is not a simple hero or villain, but a human being of extraordinary gifts and terrible flaws, driven by ambitions that no amount of conquest could satisfy. What he would do with 3 more decades depends on understanding that drive, that hunger for glory that would not be satiated until he had surpassed every hero, god, and conqueror who came before. Whether the world could survive such a man's full ambitions is a question we will now explore. The empire at the crossroads, June 323 BCE. If we could stand on the walls of Babylon and look outward in any direction, we would see the extent of Alexander's achievement and the magnitude of his problem. From the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, from the first cataract of the Nile to the Sir Daria River in Central Asia, his empire sprawled across 3 million square miles. More than 25 ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, following different laws and customs, all supposedly united under one king. It was magnificent and completely unstable. Let us survey this empire systematically, understanding what Alexander actually controlled and what he merely claimed. In the west, Macedonia and Greece were the foundation. Macedonia itself was relatively stable under Antipater, the old general Alexander had left as regent. But Greece proper was another matter. The Greek city-states had submitted to Macedonian hegemony under Philip II after the Battle of Cheronea in 338 BCE. Alexander renewed this arrangement at the beginning of his reign, but Greek submission was always reluctant. Athens, Sparta, Thebes all chafed under Macedonian dominance. When Alexander left for Asia, he had to crush a Theban revolt and raise the city as an example. Sparta remained stubbornly independent, having refused to join the League of Corinth. During Alexander's campaigns, Sparta actually rebelled, and had to be defeated by Antipater in 331 BCE. The message was clear. Greek submission was maintained by force and fear, not genuine loyalty. If Alexander died suddenly, Greece would explode into revolt. Multiple sources confirm that in our timeline, the Greeks began preparing rebellion as soon as news of Alexander's death reached them. Only Antipater's swift military action prevented widespread uprising. So in this first territory, the very heartland of Hellenic civilization that Alexander claimed to champion, his rule rested on military occupation rather than consent. Moving east, across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, we find a more complex situation. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, Ephesus and Miletus and others, generally welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. He had restored democratic governments, lowered taxes, and presented himself as the champion of Hellenism against Persian despotism. These cities were relatively content under his rule. But inland Anatolia was different. The Persian satrapal system had governed here for 2 centuries, and Alexander had simply taken it over, replacing Persian satraps with Macedonian ones. Local populations, neither Greek nor Persian, had little reason to care who ruled them as long as taxes were bearable and order maintained. They were subjects, not participants in Alexander's empire. Syria and the Levantine coast had fallen to Alexander after his victory at Issus in 333 BCE and the subsequent siege of Tyre. This was wealthy, urbanized territory, and Alexander needed it for resources and as a base for his Egyptian campaign. The Phoenician cities, especially Tyre after its devastating siege, were thoroughly subdued. The Jewish population in Judea had submitted peacefully, and Alexander had shrewdly cultivated their goodwill by respecting their temple and religious customs. But this was fundamentally occupied territory, held by Macedonian garrisons and governed through military commanders. Egypt deserves special attention. Alexander's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE was almost bloodless. The Persians were hated there, their rule seen as foreign domination. Alexander, by contrast, presented himself as liberator and rightful pharaoh. He undertook the dangerous journey to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, where he was supposedly confirmed as son of Zeus Ammon, which conveniently aligned with Egyptian traditions of divine kingship. He founded Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Egypt under Alexander was prosperous and relatively stable, governed by Cleomenes, a Greek official of dubious reputation but effective administrative skills. Yet even here, stability was superficial. The Egyptian priesthood accepted Alexander because he played the pharaonic role correctly, but they had no particular loyalty to Macedonia. The Greek and Macedonian population was tiny, concentrated in Alexandria and a few garrisons. If central authority weakened, Egypt would naturally seek independence, and someone like Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable generals, would be perfectly positioned to seize it. The heart of the empire was Mesopotamia and the Persian core territories. Here Alexander faced his greatest challenge. He had defeated Darius III at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, entered Babylon in triumph, burned Persepolis, an act he reportedly regretted, and claimed the Persian throne. But claiming a throne and ruling effectively were different matters. The Persian Empire had been a sophisticated administrative machine, developed over 2 centuries by Cyrus, Darius the Fair, and their successors. The satrapy system, the royal road, the standardized administration, all this continued under Alexander because he needed it to function. But there was profound ambiguity about what this meant. Was Alexander a Macedonian conqueror who happened to control Persian territory? Or was he the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings, a Persian monarch who happened to be Macedonian? His attempt to fuse both identities pleased no one. The Persians saw him as a foreign conqueror, regardless of his adoption of Persian dress and customs. The Macedonians saw his Persianization as betrayal. He existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, trying to be both and satisfying neither. The eastern satrapies, Bactria and Sogdiana, had required years of brutal warfare to subdue. These regions, roughly modern Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, were mountainous, populated by fierce peoples accustomed to resisting central authority. Alexander had to adopt a scorched earth policy, besieging fortresses, crushing resistance with exemplary cruelty, eventually marrying Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble, to cement peace. By 323 BCE, these regions were nominally controlled but still required significant military presence. They were conquest zones, not integrated provinces. Beyond lay India, or rather the small portion of India that Alexander had conquered. His campaign across the Indus River, his victory over King Porus at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, had given him control of Punjab, but his army's refusal to march further had limited his ambitions. The Indian territories were the empire's furthest extremity, connected to the center by tenuous supply lines across desert and mountain. Alexander had installed Macedonian governors and left garrisons, but everyone knew these territories would be first to break away if central authority weakened. Now consider the demographic reality. The entire Macedonian and Greek population available to Alexander numbered perhaps a few 100,000 at most. The Persian Empire's population has been estimated at 50 million or more. Alexander was attempting to rule millions of Persians, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Bactrians, Indians, and others with a tiny Macedonian Greek elite. The mathematics alone suggested impossibility. His solution was to maintain the Persian administrative structure while placing Macedonians and Greeks in key positions. Satraps were a mix of Persians who had submitted and Macedonian generals. The army, the ultimate guarantee of power, remained predominantly Macedonian and Greek in its core units, though increasingly supplemented by Persian and other Asian troops trained in Macedonian methods. The treasury, based in Babylon, controlled enormous wealth looted from Persian hordes and extracted from taxes. But the whole edifice depended on Alexander's personal authority and charisma. This brings us to the fundamental structural problem. Alexander had conquered an empire but had not created a stable system for ruling it. Everything depended on him personally. When he was present, his force of personality, his military reputation, his willingness to use exemplary violence maintained order, but the empire was too vast for him to be everywhere. Regions he had not visited for years relied on his governor's loyalty, which was itself questionable. His companions were ambitious men who had grown wealthy from conquest. What prevented them from carving out independent kingdoms? Only Alexander's life and the threat of his wrath. The succession question was catastrophic. Alexander had no clear heir in 323 BCE. Roxana was pregnant, but with an uncertain outcome. His half-brother Aridaeus was mentally disabled and unsuitable to rule. Alexander had made no arrangements, apparently believing himself invincible or simply unwilling to think about mortality. This was criminally irresponsible given what was at stake. When he died in our timeline, the empire had no mechanism for transferring power, no clear successor, no institutional structure that could function without him. The immediate result was nearly 40 years of warfare among his generals, the Wars of the Diadochi, as they fought to control pieces of the empire or establish themselves as Alexander's legitimate successor. These wars were brutal and destructive, killing hundreds of thousands, destroying cities, consuming the wealth Alexander had accumulated. Eventually, the empire fragmented into several Hellenistic kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedonia, plus smaller states. None could reunite Alexander's conquests. The unity he had imposed by force dissolved into chaos. But what if he lived? What if instead of sudden death, Alexander had decades to address these structural problems? Could he create stable institutions? Could he resolve the Greco-Persian cultural conflict? Could he establish a legitimate succession? Could he, in short, transform his conquest into a lasting empire, rather than a personal fiefdom held together by his individual presence. The task was enormous but not impossible. The Roman Empire would later demonstrate that diverse territories could be integrated under effective administration. The earlier Persian Empire had lasted 2 centuries before Alexander destroyed it. The Byzantine Empire would endure for a millennium. Building stable imperial structures was difficult but achievable. The question is whether Alexander had the patience, wisdom, and time to do it. His character suggests skepticism. He was fundamentally a warrior, bored by administration, impatient with details, always looking to the next campaign. The careful work of building institutions, training bureaucrats, codifying laws, establishing succession mechanisms, all this required a temperament Alexander seemed to lack. He wanted glory, not good governance. He wanted to surpass Achilles, not emulate Augustus. Yet people can change, especially under necessity. At 32, Alexander was still essentially the young man who had charged across the Granicus. At 42, 52, 62, he would face different challenges requiring different skills. A wounded, aging king with heirs to protect might develop administrative sophistication he lacked in youth, or desperation might drive innovation. He could see the empire beginning to fragment and take measures to prevent it. Moreover, 30 years is a long time. Even if Alexander himself remained impatient with governance, he could delegate to capable administrators. Ptolemy, Seleucus, and others proved themselves excellent rulers of their own kingdoms after Alexander's death. If kept loyal and given proper authority, they could build the administrative structures Alexander found tedious. The key would be keeping them loyal, giving them enough power to be effective, but not enough to be independent. The cultural question was perhaps more intractable. The fusion of Greek and Persian civilizations that Alexander desired required genuine synthesis, not just the king wearing Persian pants and demanding prostration. It required intermarriage, shared institutions, mutual respect, gradual development of a common identity. This was possible in theory. The Hellenistic world that emerged after Alexander did see significant cultural mixing. Greek became the lingua franca of the Near East. Greek culture influenced local traditions while being influenced in turn. The process took centuries, but it happened. With Alexander alive and actively promoting fusion, the process might accelerate. His mass marriages at Susa could be the beginning rather than an isolated event. Financial incentives could encourage intermarriage. Greek education could be offered to Persian nobles, creating a bilingual elite. Shared military service could break down barriers as Macedonians and Persians fought side by side. Over decades, a genuine Greco-Persian aristocracy might emerge, loyal to the empire because it benefited from it. But this required Alexander to moderate his Hellenistic chauvinism and his Macedonian companions to overcome their ethnic prejudices. Both were difficult. Greek cultural superiority was deeply ingrained. The Macedonians, who had fought to conquer Persia, were not going to see Persians as equals easily. Alexander would need to force the issue, and forcing cultural change usually provokes resistance. As we contemplate Alexander surviving his illness in Babylon, we must understand he faced not just the opportunity of 3 more decades, but the challenge of transforming a conquest into a civilization. The empire stood at a crossroads. One path led to fragmentation and the Hellenistic kingdoms of our timeline. The other path, if Alexander lived and chose it, led somewhere unprecedented. And the first step on that path was surviving, recovering, and deciding what to do next. Surviving Babylon. The alternate path begins. The fever burns through the night, through the next day, through another night. The physicians work frantically. Macedonian doctors trained in Greek methods, Persian physicians with their own traditions, even a Babylonian practitioner of ancient medicine, all attend the king. They apply poultices, they bleed him, they force medicines down his throat, they pray to their respective gods. The companions maintain vigil, rotating through the chamber, watching their king fight for his life. Outside, word spreads through Babylon and beyond. The empire holds its breath. On the third day, something changes. The fever, which has burned at deadly heights, begins to diminish. Alexander, who has been delirious, speaking in tongues, sometimes lucid enough to recognize Hephaestion's death, was recent and weeping anew, begins to show awareness. His eyes focus. He recognizes Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus. He manages to speak, his voice weak but intelligible. "Water," he rasps, and they bring it gladly. This simple request proof that death's grip is loosening. Recovery is slow, agonizing. Whatever disease or poison had struck him has left him weakened in ways he's never experienced. Alexander, who once marched his army 30 miles in a day, who fought in the front lines for hours, who seemed to have inhuman endurance, now struggles to stand. His wounds, old friends that normally troubled him little, ache with new intensity. The arrow wound in his lung from the Malian city, the cut on his head from a Scythian club, the countless smaller injuries accumulated over 14 years of campaigning, all make themselves felt. The psychological impact is almost worse than the physical. Alexander has always believed himself protected by the gods, destined for greatness, immune to the common mortality of other men. This brush with death shakes that certainty. For the first time, he has felt his own fragility, understood viscerally that he too can die. The realization changes him in ways that will become apparent only later. The immediate political consequences are profound. In our timeline, Alexander's death triggered instant crisis. His generals immediately began maneuvering for advantage, and within hours the empire began its slow-motion disintegration. But in this alternate timeline, his survival forestalls that crisis. The generals who had been preparing for the succession struggle must instead revert to their roles as subordinates. Plans to seize territory are abandoned or postponed. The unity of command is maintained, but the illness has exposed the empire's fundamental weakness. Everyone has seen how close it came to dissolution. Everyone understands now that everything depends on Alexander's life. This awareness creates its own dynamics. The generals become more cautious, more attentive to maintaining good relations with the king, because they have seen how quickly everything could change. At the same time, they cannot help but think about succession, about what happens when death finally comes, as it must eventually. Alexander himself draws different conclusions from his survival. In our timeline, he died believing himself invincible. In this timeline, he lives knowing he is vulnerable. This could make him more cautious, more concerned with building something lasting, or it could make him more reckless, desperate to achieve his remaining ambitions before death finally claims him. Given his character, the latter seems more likely. As strength returns over weeks and then months, Alexander begins planning again. The Arabian Campaign, which he had been organizing before his illness, remains his immediate objective, but his perspective has shifted slightly. He is more concerned now with succession, with ensuring his empire will survive him. Roxana's pregnancy, which had been merely noted before his illness, now becomes crucial. He needs an heir, a son to inherit his conquests and carry forward his vision. The birth, when it comes, is male. In our timeline, Alexander IV was born after his father's death, a posthumous son who never knew his legendary father and who was murdered before reaching adulthood. In this timeline, Alexander lives to see his son's birth, to hold him, to begin imagining his future. The child is immediately declared heir. Celebrations are ordered throughout the empire. Alexander IV, born in the shadow of his father's near death, becomes the focus of dynastic hopes. But one son is not enough, not for an empire this vast and this fragile. Alexander recognizes the need for multiple heirs, both to ensure succession if something happens to Alexander IV, and to provide options for dividing the empire if necessary. He takes his marriages more seriously now. Statera, daughter of Darius III, has been a political marriage barely consummated. He turns attention to her, and she too conceives. Parysatis, his third wife, daughter of the previous Persian king Artaxerxes III, receives similar attention. This focus on dynasty and succession is new for Alexander. The young conqueror had been unconcerned with such matters, believing himself invincible and his conquests sufficient. The man who survives Babylon is different, older in ways that transcend the few months of illness, forced by mortality's touch to think about legacy in concrete terms. By early 322 BCE, almost a year after his illness, Alexander has regained most of his strength. He is not the same physical specimen he once was. The illness has taken something permanent from him, a reduction in stamina, a vulnerability to fatigue, but he is still formidable, still capable of commanding armies, still possessed of that terrifying charisma that bends men to his will, and he is ready to campaign again. The decision to proceed with the Arabian Campaign is not just about conquest. It is about demonstrating that he is still Alexander, still the invincible king, still capable of great deeds. The illness has shaken confidence, both his own and others. A successful campaign will restore it. Moreover, Arabia offers strategic and economic advantages that appeal to his increasingly sophisticated understanding of empire. He spends months in preparation, more carefully than before the illness. The army is reorganized, with more emphasis on Persian and Asian troops integrated into Macedonian formations. The navy is expanded, drawing on Phoenician expertise and timber from Lebanon. Supply lines are meticulously planned. Alexander has learned from his near-death experience. If he is to continue campaigning, he must do so more carefully, with better preparation, with redundancies and contingencies that his youthful invincibility had scorned. His relationship with his companions has changed subtly. They are more deferential now, more careful in their disagreements. The illness has reminded everyone of Alexander's mortality, but paradoxically, it has also increased his authority. He has survived what should have killed him, and in the ancient world, such survival suggests divine favor. His claim to be son of Zeus Ammon, always somewhat pretentious to his Macedonian companions, now seems more credible. The gods have preserved him for some purpose. Who are mere mortals to question his will? Yet cracks remain in the foundation. The Macedonian veterans, the men who have followed him from the Granicus to the Indus, are exhausted and want to go home. Alexander's survival means the campaigns will continue, and they resent it. The tensions that led to the mutiny at the Hyphasis River have not been resolved, merely postponed. Alexander will need to address this discontent, either by allowing veterans to retire and return home, or by finding ways to buy their continued loyalty. The Persian nobility remains fundamentally unreconciled to Macedonian rule. They serve Alexander because resistance is futile, but they remember the burning of Persepolis, the execution of their king Darius, the reduction of their once great empire to a Macedonian possession. Alexander's adoption of Persian customs has not changed this. If anything, they find it insulting that he thinks putting on Persian dress makes him one of them. True integration will require more than theatrical gestures. As Alexander prepares for Arabia, he is also thinking beyond it. The Western Mediterranean beckons. Carthage, that wealthy Phoenician colony in North Africa, controls western sea routes and has never acknowledged his authority. The Italian peninsula, with its Greek colonies and the rising power of Rome, is unknown territory waiting to be explored and conquered. The northern frontiers face constant pressure from Scythian and other nomadic peoples. There are always more worlds to conquer, more peoples to subjugate, more glory to accumulate. But can an aging body sustain such ambitions? Alexander in 322 BCE is 33 years old, still young by most standards, but carrying wounds and weariness that make him older. He has perhaps another 30 years of life, if fortune favors him and he avoids further illness or fatal wounds. 30 years is enough for several major campaigns, for reorganizing the empire, for raising his sons to adulthood and preparing them for rule. It is enough to fundamentally reshape the world if he uses the time wisely. The question is whether wisdom is possible for a man of Alexander's temperament. The illness has introduced caution, but it has not changed his fundamental nature. He remains driven by the need to surpass every hero who came before, to achieve glory that will echo through eternity. Such men do not retire to careful administration and prudent governance. They campaign until death finally claims them, and they take the world along on their journey. As spring arrives in 322 BCE and the campaigning season begins, Alexander marches south from Babylon toward Arabia. The alternate path has been chosen. The empire will not fragment, not yet. Instead, it will be transformed by 3 more decades of this extraordinary man's will. What follows will be unprecedented in human history, and its consequences will reverberate across the centuries. The Arabian Campaign, the deserts of Arabia in 322 BCE, are largely unknown to the Mediterranean world. The Greeks and Macedonians have heard tales of wealthy incense kingdoms, of frankincense and myrrh flowing north along caravan routes, of pearl fisheries in the Persian Gulf, of mysterious peoples living in burning wastelands. But concrete knowledge is limited. Alexander, with his characteristic ambition, sees Arabia not as impenetrable mystery, but as his next conquest, a land to be explored, mapped, subdued, and integrated into his empire. The strategic logic is compelling. Arabia controls the maritime routes between Egypt and India, between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Its incense trade generates enormous wealth that currently flows to Arabian merchants and kingdoms rather than into Alexander's treasury. Its position makes it a potential launching point for further conquests in Africa or toward India via the sea route. And practically, leaving Arabia independent creates a gap in his empire, an uncontrolled territory between his Mediterranean and Asian possessions. But there is also psychological motivation. Arabia is unknown, unconquered territory. The Persian Empire, despite its vastness, had never subdued Arabia. Cyrus the Great had allegedly died fighting Macedonian on the empire's northern frontier, but the south had remained free. If Alexander can conquer where the Achaemenids failed, it will be another proof of his superiority, another achievement to add to his legend. The campaign begins with a naval expedition. Alexander has learned from the disastrous march of his army through the Gedrosian desert after India, where thousands died of thirst and starvation. He will not repeat that mistake. Instead, the navy will explore the coast, establish supply depots, and support the army's advance. Nearchus, who had commanded the successful naval voyage from India to Mesopotamia, is placed in charge of the fleet. He is one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, a Cretan who has served since childhood, and a skilled navigator. The fleet departs from Babylon in spring 322 BCE, sailing down the Euphrates to the Persian Gulf. The ships are predominantly triremes and lighter vessels, designed for warfare and coastal exploration rather than deep-sea voyages. The crews are mixed: Phoenician sailors who know the Mediterranean, Greek marines, Persian Gulf fishermen who understand local waters, even some Indians recruited during the campaigns in the Indus region. This diversity is emblematic of Alexander's evolving empire, where different peoples contribute their expertise to common enterprises. The initial surveys are encouraging. The Arabian coast, while harsh, offers anchorages and water sources. The pearl fisheries of the Gulf are discovered and immediately intrigue Alexander. Pearls are luxury goods, valuable in trade, and their control would add to imperial revenues. Fishing villages and small ports are encountered, their inhabitants awed by the appearance of this massive foreign fleet. Some submit peacefully, others are subdued by marine landings. Meanwhile, Alexander advances overland with the main army. He has perhaps 50,000 troops, a mixed force of Macedonian phalanx, companion cavalry, Persian cavalry, light infantry from various subject peoples, and a siege train. This is smaller than his earlier invasion forces, but still formidable. The army moves south along the western coast of the Gulf, establishing camps, building supply magazines, securing water sources. The Arabian interior presents different challenges than anything Alexander has previously encountered. This is not the riverine civilizations of Mesopotamia, nor the fertile valleys of Persia, nor even the mountains of Afghanistan. This is true desert, vast stretches of sand and rock where water is scarce and the sun is merciless. The Bedouin tribes who inhabit these wastes are elusive, attacking caravans and then disappearing into the desert. They cannot be brought to decisive battle, the kind of engagement where Alexander's military genius shines. He adapts. Small mobile units are sent to patrol trade routes and protect caravans. Bedouin sheikhs are approached with offers of alliance and payment for guarding routes. Some accept, seeing profit in cooperation. Others resist and are pursued by Alexander's cavalry, hunted through the wadis and oases until submission or death. It is a different kind of warfare than the great set-piece battles against Persian armies, more police action than conquest, but necessary for controlling the territory. The incense kingdoms of southern Arabia, particularly the kingdom of the Sabaeans in what is now Yemen, are the real prizes. These kingdoms have grown wealthy from the monopoly on frankincense and myrrh, aromatics essential for religious ceremonies throughout the Mediterranean world. The trade routes run north through Arabian deserts to Gaza and other ports, or by sea from southern ports to Egypt and beyond. Alexander wants control of this trade, both for revenue and for the strategic leverage it provides. But reaching southern Arabia requires either a long desert march or a naval approach around the Arabian Peninsula. The first is impractical with a large army. The second is undertaken by Nearchus with part of the fleet. In late 322 BCE, as Alexander consolidates control of northern and eastern Arabia, Nearchus sails south along the Arabian coast, carefully mapping the shoreline, establishing contact with coastal settlements, probing for weaknesses in the incense kingdom's defences. The voyage is difficult. The monsoon winds, which later become well known to Indian Ocean sailors, are poorly understood. The fleet encounters storms, runs short of water, must make frequent landings for supplies. But Nearchus perseveres, and by early 321 BCE, his ships reach the incense ports of southern Arabia. The Sabaean kingdom, faced with this naval threat, and hearing of Alexander's army in the north, enters negotiations. The resulting treaty is characteristic of Alexander's evolving diplomatic sophistication. The Sabaeans maintain internal autonomy, keep their monarchy, practice their religion freely, but they acknowledge Alexander as overlord, pay substantial tribute in incense and gold, and open their ports to his ships. Sabaean merchants can continue their trade, but Alexander's officials will collect duties. It is not direct conquest but vassalage, a more subtle approach than the total subjugation he imposed earlier in his career. By mid-321 BCE, Alexander's Arabian campaign can be declared successful. Northern and eastern Arabia are under direct control, garrisoned by Macedonian and Persian troops. Southern Arabia is tributary. The incense trade flows through imperial channels, adding significantly to the treasury. Naval bases are established at key points along the coasts, facilitating future maritime expeditions. New cities are founded, bearing Alexander's name, populated by Greek and Macedonian colonists mixed with local populations. The campaign has demonstrated several important things. First, that Alexander's near-death experience has not diminished his military effectiveness. He remains capable of organizing and executing complex operations. Second, that his empire building is becoming more sophisticated. The nuanced approach to the Sabaeans suggests learning from experience, recognition that not every conquest needs to be total. Third, that the integration of different peoples into his military and administrative system is progressing. The Arabian campaign succeeds because Phoenician sailors, Persian cavalry, Macedonian infantry, and Greek engineers all contribute their specialized skills. But the campaign has also been costly in time and resources. Nearly 2 years have been spent subduing Arabia, 2 years during which potential problems elsewhere in the empire have been postponed rather than addressed. The Macedonian veterans remain restive, their demands for discharge and return home unmet. The Greek cities, always resentful of Macedonian hegemony, have had time to nurse their grievances. The Persian nobility have watched Alexander campaign in Arabia while their own lands remain under foreign occupation, their resentment deepening, and Alexander himself has changed further. The wounds and hardships of the campaign, added to the lingering effects of his illness, have aged him perceptibly. He is now 34, but looks older. Grey has appeared in his hair, lines in his face. The physical invincibility of youth is definitely gone, replaced by the accumulated damage of 15 years of campaigning. He must think more carefully about husbanding his strength, about choosing battles rather than fighting all of them. Yet the Arabian campaign has also rekindled his ambition, the successful conquest, the wealth flowing into his treasury, the expansion of his empire into new territories. All this reminds him of earlier triumphs. Arabia was a challenge, and he overcame it. What else can he achieve with the decades potentially remaining to him? The Western Mediterranean beckons. Carthage, Rome, the wealthy cities of Sicily and southern Italy all wait unconquered. The thought begins to form in his mind. Why stop in Arabia when there is a whole world to the west still to be subdued? Before pursuing new conquests, however, he must address the empire's internal problems. The Macedonian veterans, who have been promised discharge since the Hyphasis River, cannot be put off forever. The succession must be secured, his sons educated and prepared for power. The administrative structure needs reform and strengthening. The cultural tensions between Macedonians and Persians must be managed. These are not tasks that appeal to Alexander's warrior nature, but they are necessary if the empire is to outlast him. He returns to Babylon in late 321 BCE, having been absent for over 2 years. The city has grown even more magnificent in his absence. New constructions rising along the Euphrates, gardens and palaces reflecting the wealth of empire. But Babylon is also stifling, hot, urban, political. Alexander finds himself restless within weeks of his return. The campaigns are where he feels alive, where his genius operates freely. Administration bores him. Court politics frustrate him. The careful balancing of competing interests seems beneath him. Yet he forces himself to attend to these matters. He holds audiences with satraps reporting from distant provinces. He reviews tax revenues and approves expenditures for public works. He adjudicates disputes between Macedonian and Persian officials. He spends time with Roxana and his son Alexander IV, now over a year old, trying to understand fatherhood and finding it foreign to his nature. He meets with his other wives, ensuring the dynasty is expanding. He plans the founding of new cities and the repair of old ones. And he thinks about his next campaign, because ultimately that is who he is. Alexander the Administrator is a role he can play when necessary, but Alexander the Conqueror is his true identity. Arabia has been conquered, but the world is vast, and there are always more horizons. The question is not whether he will campaign again, but where and when. And as he studies maps in his Babylonian palace, as he consults with advisors about trade routes and foreign kingdoms, his eyes keep returning westward, to that unknown world beyond Greece where destiny might offer one more chance at eternal glory. The Western Mediterranean, Carthage and Rome by 320 BCE, Alexander has consolidated his Eastern Empire. Arabia is subdued, Persia is stable, the Indian territories are secure. His sons are growing, the succession appears established. The Macedonian veterans have finally been allowed to return home, replaced by younger men eager for glory and by Asian troops trained in Macedonian warfare. The empire's administration has been reformed, with clearer lines of authority and better integration between Macedonian and Persian officials. Alexander is 35 years old, scarred and weathered but still vigorous, and his ambitions remain boundless. The decision to turn west is both strategic and personal. Strategically, the Western Mediterranean represents unclaimed territory, wealthy cities and kingdoms that could add significantly to the empire. Carthage controls North African coasts and is wealthy from trade. Sicily and southern Italy are dotted with prosperous Greek colonies. Rome, though still a relatively minor power, is expanding in central Italy and could become a future threat if left alone. From a purely imperial perspective, these territories are logical targets for expansion. But the personal motivations are equally important. Alexander has conquered the Persian Empire, the greatest civilization of the East. To truly surpass all previous conquerors, to achieve glory that will never be equaled, he must also conquer the West. He must unite the entire Mediterranean world under his rule, create an empire that spans from the Atlantic to India, from the Sahara to the Danube. Only then will his achievement be complete. Only then will he have surpassed Achilles, Heracles, and all the heroes of myth. The comparison with his ancestor Heracles is particularly significant. According to myth, Heracles had travelled to the western Mediterranean, performed labours there, passed through the straits that bear his name. If Alexander is to equal or surpass Heracles, he must follow the same path, conquer the same lands, perhaps reach even farther. This mythological motivation might seem irrational to modern sensibilities, but for Alexander, it is deadly serious. His self-conception as a figure of destiny, as someone fated to achieve what no mortal has achieved, drives him as powerfully as any strategic calculation. The campaign begins with reconnaissance. Ships are sent westward from Egypt and from Sicily, exploring the North African coast, making contact with Carthaginian trading posts, gathering intelligence about Carthaginian military capabilities. Other expeditions sail to southern Italy, visiting the Greek colonies there, gauging their attitude toward Macedonian intervention. Alexander knows from his father Philip's example that good intelligence is crucial for successful campaigning. What they discover is both encouraging and concerning. Carthage is wealthy and powerful, with a formidable navy and extensive territory in North Africa, Sicily, and Spain. The Carthaginians are Phoenicians, descendants of colonists from Tyre and Sidon, cities that Alexander conquered years before. They are skilled sailors and traders, with a commercial empire based on controlling maritime trade routes. But their military is largely composed of mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers, and their political system is oligarchic and faction-ridden. The Greek cities of southern Italy and Sicily, collectively known as Magna Graecia, are culturally Hellenic but politically independent. Cities like Syracuse, Tarentum, and Croton are wealthy and sophisticated, with their own histories of warfare and alliances. They view themselves as Greek, but have developed distinct identities separate from mainland Greece. Their attitude toward Alexander is ambivalent. He is a Macedonian, which many Greeks view as barely civilized, but he has also presented himself as the champion of Hellenism against Persian barbarism. Would they welcome him as liberator or resist him as conqueror? Rome is still relatively unknown to the Greek world. Intelligence reports describe it as a significant power in central Italy, with a citizen army of impressive discipline and a republican government. The Romans have recently defeated the Samnites in a series of wars and are expanding their influence throughout the Italian peninsula. They are not yet the world power they will become, but they are clearly ambitious and dangerous. Alexander's advisors are divided on whether to view Rome as potential ally or inevitable enemy. The strategic plan that emerges from these reconnaissance efforts is ambitious even by Alexander's standards. The campaign will proceed in phases. First, secure Sicily by allying with or conquering the Greek cities and expelling Carthaginian influence. Second, cross to North Africa and attack Carthage itself, eliminating the Western Mediterranean's dominant naval power. Third, move up the Italian peninsula, dealing with Rome and other Italian powers. The ultimate goal is to control the entire Western Mediterranean, adding it to the Eastern Empire and creating a truly universal dominion. In spring 319 BCE, Alexander marches west from Babylon. He brings perhaps 60,000 troops, a smaller force than his earlier invasion of Persia, but still formidable. The army is more diverse than ever, with Macedonian and Greek troops forming the core, but Asian cavalry and infantry making up nearly half the force. The fleet, based in Egyptian and Phoenician ports, numbers several hundred warships. This is an amphibious campaign, requiring close coordination between army and navy, the kind of complex operation that Alexander excels at organizing. The first objective is Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily. Syracuse has a complicated history of warfare with Carthage, and Alexander hopes to present himself as ally against the common Carthaginian enemy. His approach is diplomatic initially. Envoys are sent proposing an alliance, offering Syracusan control over eastern Sicily in exchange for supporting Alexander's campaign against Carthage. Syracuse, ruled by a tyrant named Agathocles in our timeline, but by different rulers in this alternate chronology, must decide whether to trust the Macedonian king. The Syracusan response is cautious acceptance. They have heard of Alexander's conquests, know his reputation for both generosity and ruthlessness. An alliance seems safer than resistance. Moreover, eliminating Carthaginian power in Sicily would benefit Syracuse enormously. The alliance is formalized in summer 319 BCE, and Alexander's army crosses from southern Italy to Sicily without opposition. The Greek cities of Sicily largely follow Syracuse's lead, joining Alexander's coalition. The Carthaginian strongholds in western Sicily, however, resist. Cities like Panormus, modern Palermo, and Lilybaeum are heavily fortified and garrisoned by Carthaginian troops and mercenaries. Alexander lays siege to these cities, bringing to bear the sophisticated siege equipment and techniques that had broken Tyre and other fortified cities in his eastern campaigns. The sieges are brutal and prolonged. Carthaginian naval relief attempts are fought off by Alexander's Phoenician and Greek ships, with heavy losses on both sides. The defenders, knowing that Alexander often massacres resistant cities' populations, fight desperately. But one by one, the Carthaginian strongholds fall. By early 318 BCE, Alexander controls all of Sicily, except for a few isolated fortresses. The island, with its agricultural wealth and strategic position, is absorbed into his empire. But the conquest of Sicily is merely prelude. The real campaign targets Carthage itself. In summer 318 BCE, Alexander crosses from Sicily to North Africa with his army. The landing is opposed by Carthaginian forces, but Alexander's combined arms tactics, perfected over years of campaigning, prove decisive. The battle on the beaches is short and bloody, ending with Carthaginian retreat toward Carthage itself. The siege of Carthage becomes one of the epic campaigns of Alexander's career. The city is magnificently fortified, with triple walls on the landward side and naval access to the sea. The population is large and wealthy, able to hire mercenaries from across the Mediterranean and Africa. The Carthaginians, fighting for their survival, display desperate courage, but they face Alexander at the height of his powers, commanding an experienced multicultural army and a fleet that can blockade the city. From the sea, the siege lasts through 318 BCE and into 317 BCE. Alexander's engineers construct massive siege towers and battering rams. Mines are dug beneath the walls. Naval assaults are launched against the city's harbors. The defenders counter with every technique known to ancient warfare. Sorties to burn siege equipment, countermines to collapse Alexander's tunnels, Greek fire-like substances hurled from the walls, desperate naval raids to break the blockade. The turning point comes in spring 317 BCE, when Alexander's miners finally collapse a section of the western wall. Macedonian troops pour through the gap and brutal street fighting ensues. The Carthaginians, knowing that defeat means death or enslavement, resist house by house. But numbers and discipline tell. Within days, Carthaginian resistance collapses. The city surrenders on terms. The population will be spared, but will pay enormous indemnity. The Carthaginian navy will be surrendered, and the city will become a client state of Alexander's empire. The fall of Carthage reverberates across the Mediterranean. The Western world's greatest power has been broken by the Eastern conqueror. Every city, every kingdom must now recalculate their position. Can anyone resist this Macedonian king who has conquered from India to the Atlantic? The question particularly troubles Rome, where the Senate watches Alexander's approach with growing alarm. Roman-Macedonian relations have been minimal to this point. Rome is focused on Italy, consolidating control over the Samnites and other peoples. But Alexander's conquest of Sicily and Carthage brings him to Italy's doorstep. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia, previously independent, are now submitting to Alexander or being conquered. Tarentum, Croton, and other cities send delegations offering alliance or seeking protection. Rome must decide whether to acknowledge Alexander's supremacy or prepare for war. The Senate is divided. Some senators argue for accommodation. Rome is powerful in Italy, but cannot match an empire that spans from India to North Africa. Better to seek alliance, maintain independence in internal affairs, perhaps even benefit from access to Alexander's vast trade networks. Other senators, particularly the more conservative and proud, argue for resistance. Rome has never bowed to foreign kings, has defeated every enemy it has faced. To submit to Alexander would betray Roman values and invite future exploitation. The debate is resolved by Alexander's actions. In 316 BCE, having secured North Africa and Sicily, he marches north into southern Italy. His army, now supplemented by Carthaginian and Sicilian troops, numbers perhaps 70,000. He takes his time, moving methodically, securing each Greek city, establishing supply lines, preparing for sustained campaigning. This is not the impetuous youth who charged across the Granicus, but a mature commander who has learned the value of preparation. Roman ambassadors meet Alexander at Tarentum. The encounter is carefully staged, each side trying to impress the other. The Romans present themselves as proud republicans, free citizens who elect their leaders and conquer through civic virtue rather than following a king. Alexander presents himself as the master of the world, divinely ordained, undefeated in battle, offering Rome the choice of alliance or destruction. The negotiations are tense and ultimately unsuccessful. The Romans offer friendship and trade agreements, but will not acknowledge Alexander as overlord. They will not pay tribute or provide troops for his campaigns. From their perspective, this is a reasonable position, maintaining dignity while avoiding unnecessary conflict. From Alexander's perspective, it is insufferable arrogance from a minor Italian city-state. His ego, his sense of destiny, his need to be acknowledged as supreme, will not tolerate Roman independence. War becomes inevitable. The Roman army that marches south to confront Alexander in 316 BCE numbers perhaps 30,000 men, formidable by Italian standards, but smaller than Alexander's force. They are organized into legions, a distinctly Roman formation different from both the Macedonian phalanx and Greek hoplite armies. They pride themselves on discipline and endurance, qualities developed in the Samnite Wars. The two armies meet in Lucania, in southern Italy, in what becomes known as the Battle of Heraclea. The battle is hard fought, a genuine test of Alexander's generalship against Roman military organization. The Roman legions are more flexible than the phalanx, able to adapt to terrain and maneuver in smaller units. Their discipline under pressure is remarkable, but Alexander's combined arms approach, using cavalry to envelop the Roman flanks while the phalanx pins them frontally, proves decisive. The battle ends with Roman retreat, though not rout. They withdraw in good order, having inflicted significant casualties on Alexander's force. This is significant because it is the first time Alexander has faced an enemy that could partially counter his tactics. The Persians, for all their numbers, had been tactically inferior. The Indians had brave elephants but poor coordination. The Romans display a level of military sophistication that earns Alexander's respect, even as it hardens his determination to crush them completely. The war continues through 315 and 314 BCE. Alexander advances methodically up the Italian peninsula, besieging cities, defeating Roman forces in the field, establishing supply bases. But the Romans, fighting for their survival and their republican values, resist with determination that surprises the Macedonians. They recruit new legions to replace losses, employ scorched earth tactics to deny Alexander's supplies, use their knowledge of Italian terrain to harass his supply lines. The decisive campaign comes in 314 BCE. Alexander, frustrated by prolonged resistance, marches directly on Rome itself. The Romans gather their remaining forces for a final defense. The armies meet near Rome in summer 314 BCE in a battle that will determine Italy's future. The Roman force is perhaps 25,000 strong, facing Alexander's 50,000. Numbers favor Alexander, but the Romans fight with desperate courage, knowing defeat means the end of their republic. The Battle of Rome, as it comes to be known, is one of the bloodiest of Alexander's career. The Romans fight in deep formation, their legions absorbing charge after charge from Alexander's cavalry. The Macedonian phalanx pushes forward relentlessly, but Roman flexibility allows them to create local advantages, isolating and destroying phalanx units. For hours, the battle hangs in balance, both sides taking terrible casualties, neither able to break the other. Then Alexander makes his characteristic move. He personally leads his companion cavalry in a flanking maneuver, circles behind the Roman lines, and charges into their rear. It is vintage Alexander, the personal heroism combined with tactical brilliance that has won him so many battles. The Roman formation, attacked from both sides, begins to collapse. What had been organized resistance becomes chaos. The Romans break and run, and the Macedonian pursuit is merciless. Rome itself falls within days. The city walls cannot be held after the field army is destroyed. Alexander enters Rome in triumph, the first foreign conqueror to do so. The Senate, those proud senators who had refused submission, are forced to come before him and acknowledge his supremacy. Rome becomes a client state, required to pay tribute and provide troops for future campaigns. The Roman Republic continues to exist, but its independence is broken. The conquest of Rome in 314 BCE represents perhaps Alexander's greatest achievement of his later career. He has now defeated the two great powers of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage and Rome, and added them to an empire that already includes Persia, Egypt, and the Greek world. At 39 years old, he stands astride the ancient world more completely than any man before him. From India to the Atlantic, from the Sahara to the Danube, his word is law. But conquests of this magnitude create their own problems. The empire is now truly vast beyond comprehension. Its territories so extensive that effective governance seems impossible. Alexander cannot be everywhere, and local governors have enormous power. The cultural diversity is staggering. Greeks and Macedonians, Persians and Egyptians, Indians and Arabians, Carthaginians and Romans, dozens of other peoples, all supposedly united under one king. Maintaining unity will require administrative genius, not just military brilliance. Moreover, Alexander's health is declining. The campaigns in Sicily, North Africa, and Italy have added new wounds to his collection. He is no longer the young man who could campaign all day and carouse all night. Age and accumulated damage are taking their toll. He needs to think seriously about consolidating what he has conquered, about building institutions that will outlast him, about preparing his sons for the immense task of ruling this world empire. And yet, even now with the Mediterranean united under his rule, Alexander's ambitions are not satisfied. There are still frontiers to secure, still peoples who have not acknowledged his authority, still territories to conquer. The northern frontiers face Scythian and Germanic tribes. The deep interior of Africa is unknown. The Atlantic coast beckons with rumors of islands and lands beyond. Can he ever be satisfied? Or will he campaign until death finally claims him, always reaching for one more conquest, one more proof of his divine destiny? Northern frontiers. Scythia and beyond the Scythians had been a thorn in Alexander's side since the early campaigns. These nomadic peoples of the steppes, north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, had raided the empire's frontiers, defeated and killed Xapirion. One of Alexander's generals, in a failed expedition, and generally proven themselves elusive and dangerous enemies. Unlike the settled civilizations of Persia or Rome, the Scythians could not be conquered in a single decisive campaign. They had no cities to besiege, no capitals to capture. They could retreat endlessly into the vast grasslands, return when expeditionary forces withdrew, and resume raiding. By 313 BCE, with the western Mediterranean secured, Alexander turns his attention north. This is partly strategic necessity, securing the empire's vulnerable northern frontiers, but it is also personal challenge. His father Philip had campaigned against Scythian tribes and been defeated. Alexander, determined to surpass his father in every way, needs to succeed where Philip failed. Moreover, the Scythians represent one of the few peoples who have successfully resisted Macedonian arms, and Alexander's ego cannot tolerate such resistance. The campaign begins in spring 313 BCE, with careful preparation that reflects Alexander's matured strategic thinking. He establishes a network of fortified supply bases along the northern frontiers, stockpiling grain and equipment for a prolonged campaign. The army is reorganized for mobile warfare, with emphasis on cavalry and light infantry, rather than the heavy phalanx, more suitable for set-piece battles. Local Thracian and Sarmatian tribes are recruited as scouts and auxiliaries, their knowledge of the steppes proving invaluable. Alexander himself, now 40 years old, leads the expedition. His body carries the marks of decades of warfare. The limp from his leg wound in Illyria, the scarred shoulder from Gaza, the chronic lung problems from the Malian arrow. He can no longer fight in the front ranks with youthful abandon, but his strategic mind is sharper than ever, his understanding of logistics and operational planning refined by experience. He has become what he never imagined as a youth, a careful, methodical commander who takes calculated risks rather than reckless gambles. The initial penetration into Scythian territory is unopposed. The nomads, informed by their scouts of the Macedonian approach, simply retreat further into the steppes, taking their herds and families with them. Alexander's army advances through empty grasslands, finding abandoned campsites and grazing grounds, but no enemy to fight. It is frustrating, exhausting warfare that denies Alexander the decisive battles he prefers. But he has learned from previous campaigns against mobile enemies in Central Asia and Arabia. He divides his force into multiple columns, each capable of independent operations, that sweep across the steppes in coordinated fashion. The strategy is to compress the Scythians' room for maneuver, to trap them between converging columns, to force them into battle or drive them so far north that they cease to be threats to the empire's frontiers. The Scythians, recognizing the danger, attempt their traditional tactics. They launch raids against Alexander's supply lines, harry his columns with mounted archers, try to isolate and destroy individual units. At the Battle of the Tanais River in summer 313 BCE, they finally offer battle, hoping to defeat one of Alexander's columns before the others can support it. The battle is chaotic, swirling cavalry combat across the grasslands, very different from the organized warfare Alexander grew up with. The Macedonian victory is hard won. Alexander's cavalry, trained in shock tactics, struggles against the Scythian mounted archers who shower them with arrows while avoiding close combat. But the Macedonian discipline and the supporting infantry eventually prevail. The Scythians break and scatter, having suffered severe casualties. It is not the annihilating victory Alexander achieved at Gaugamela, but it is decisive enough. The Scythian threat to the empire's northern frontiers is significantly diminished. The campaign continues through 313 and into 312 BCE, but the character changes from conquest to pacification. Alexander establishes a chain of fortified settlements along the frontier, garrisoned by veterans and Asian troops. These serve as early warning posts and bases for punitive expeditions against raiders. He negotiates treaties with various Scythian and Sarmatian tribes, offering trade privileges and gold in exchange for peace and buffer zone creation. Some tribes accept, seeing profit in cooperation. Others retreat deeper into the steppes, beyond the reach of Macedonian power. The Northern Campaign demonstrates both Alexander's continued military effectiveness and his growing pragmatism. Unlike his youth, when he would have pursued the Scythians to the ends of the earth seeking total victory, the middle-aged Alexander accepts limited objectives. The frontier is secured, the raiding is reduced, trade routes are protected. This is sufficient. Total conquest of the endless steppes is impractical, perhaps impossible. Better to establish manageable frontiers, defend them adequately, and turn attention to other matters. By late 312 BCE, Alexander returns south, satisfied that the northern frontiers are as secure as they can be. He is 41 years old, his hair now distinctly grey, his face deeply lined, his body a map of old wounds. The years of continuous campaigning are exacting their price. He still rides and commands, still inspires his troops, but he can no longer personally lead cavalry charges or fight on the front lines. He has become a different kind of commander, one who wins through strategy and organization rather than personal heroics. The return to Babylon brings him face to face with the empire's accumulated problems. Reports from across the vast territories reveal tensions and challenges that military victories cannot solve. In Greece, the cities remain restive under Macedonian control. In Persia, the old nobility chafe at subordination to foreign rulers. In Egypt, religious factions dispute over temple revenues and authority. In the newly conquered Western territories, Carthaginians and Romans plot their restoration. The empire that Alexander built through conquest is held together by force and his personal authority, but it lacks the institutional structures that could make it stable and permanent. His sons are growing, approaching the age when they must begin learning governance. Alexander IV is now nearly 9 years old, showing promise, but also his mother, Roxana's, volatile temperament. The younger sons by Statira and Parysatis are still children, but represent the future dynasty. Alexander must begin their education in earnest, must prepare them not just to rule, but to hold together an empire of unprecedented complexity and diversity. He also faces the question of what to do with his remaining years. He has perhaps 2 decades of life left, possibly less given his wounds and declining health. Should he continue campaigning, seeking new territories to conquer? Or should he focus on consolidation, on transforming the empire from a personal conquest into a lasting institution? The warrior in him cries for more campaigns, more glory, more worlds to conquer. But the man who has faced mortality, who has sons to think about, recognizes the need for something more than endless warfare. The Northern Campaign has proven to be Alexander's last great military expedition, not by choice but by necessity. The accumulated damage to his body, the responsibilities of empire, and the growing need to address succession and administration, all combine to keep him closer to the imperial centers. He will still occasionally lead troops against rebels or to suppress uprisings, but the days of years-long campaigns into unknown territories are over. What follows are the final 2 decades of his life, spent struggling to make his conquests permanent, to build institutions that will outlast him, to create something more than a monument to personal glory. Consolidation and governance. The decade from 312 to 302 BCE marks Alexander's transformation from conqueror to administrator. This transition is not natural to his character, and he struggles with it constantly. The tedious work of governance, the endless meetings with officials, the careful balancing of competing interests, all this bores and frustrates him, but he has no choice. The empire will not govern itself, and if he does not create stable structures, everything he has built will collapse after his death. The first major reform addresses the fundamental problem of size. An empire stretching from the Atlantic to India cannot be effectively ruled from a single capital. Even with the Persian royal road system and excellent communications, decisions made in Babylon take weeks or months to reach distant provinces. and by then circumstances may have changed. Alexander needs a more distributed system that allows rapid response to local problems while maintaining overall unity. His solution is to establish 4 co-capitals, each responsible for a major region of the empire. Babylon remains the primary capital, controlling Mesopotamia and the eastern territories. Alexandria in Egypt becomes the western capital, administering Egypt, North Africa, and the western Mediterranean. Persepolis is restored and made capital of the Persian heartland. Pella in Macedonia governs Greece and the European territories. Each capital has its own administration, treasury, and military forces, but all report ultimately to Alexander and his designated successors. This quadripartite division is not partition. The empire remains unified under Alexander's supreme authority, but it recognizes the practical necessity of regional governance. Each capital is placed under a regent chosen from Alexander's most trusted companions. Ptolemy governs from Alexandria, Seleucus from Babylon, Antigonus from Persepolis, and Craterus from Pella. These men are given enormous authority within their regions, but are also carefully watched. Alexander institutes a system of inspectors, loyal officers who travel between capitals carrying messages, verifying reports, and watching for signs of disloyalty. The danger is obvious. These regional rulers could become independent monarchs, fragmenting the empire. This is exactly what happened in our timeline after Alexander's death. But in this alternate history, Alexander lives to maintain personal oversight. The regional rulers know he can march against them with overwhelming force if they rebel. Moreover, he rotates their positions every few years, preventing any from becoming too entrenched. Ptolemy, who governs Egypt in 310 BCE, is governing Persia in 305 BCE, preventing him from building an independent power base. The administrative reforms extend to the satrapy system itself. Alexander retains the Persian provincial structure, but modifies it significantly. Each satrapy is governed by a civil administrator, usually a Persian or Greek with administrative experience, who handles taxation, justice, and local governance. But military forces in each satrapy are commanded by a separate officer, always Macedonian or Greek, who reports directly to the regional capital. This separation of civilian and military authority prevents satraps from using provincial troops to rebel. Taxation is standardized across the empire. Previously, different regions paid different taxes according to local customs and Persian precedents. Alexander institutes a uniform system based on land productivity and trade revenues. The tax burden is actually reduced in most regions, winning popular support, but collection is more efficient, increasing overall revenue. The wealth flowing to the imperial treasuries is staggering. Gold and silver from Spanish mines, grain from Egypt and Ukraine, incense from Arabia, silk and spices from the eastern trade routes. This wealth is not simply hoarded. Alexander invests heavily in infrastructure, recognizing that good roads, harbors, and irrigation systems are essential for holding the empire together. The royal road system is expanded and improved, with new routes connecting Spain to India. Harbors are constructed or improved at Alexandria, Carthage, Ostia, near Rome, and dozens of other ports. Irrigation systems in Mesopotamia and Egypt are repaired and extended. These projects employ thousands, provide economic stimulus, and practically bind the empire together. The founding of cities continues, though at a slower pace than during the conquest years. By 302 BCE, Alexander has founded more than 70 cities, most named Alexandria or after himself. These are not merely military colonies, but genuine urban centers, designed to spread Hellenic culture and serve as administrative and economic hubs. The cities are carefully planned, with Greek-style agoras and theatres, Persian-style gardens and palaces, temples honoring both Greek and local gods. They represent Alexander's vision of cultural synthesis, though the reality often falls short of the ideal. The question of cultural integration remains problematic. Alexander's vision of a fused Greco-Persian civilization, which he began promoting after conquering Persia, continues to meet resistance from both sides. The Macedonians and Greeks remain convinced of their cultural superiority and resent being asked to treat Persians as equals. The Persians remember their empire's destruction and see Greek culture as imposed foreign influence. Mixed marriages, which Alexander continues to encourage with financial incentives, remain relatively rare outside the military colonies. Yet synthesis occurs despite resistance. In the cities, Greek and Persian and Egyptian, Carthaginian and other populations intermingle daily. Trade requires communication, which requires language learning. Greek becomes increasingly widespread as a common tongue, but it absorbs vocabulary and concepts from other languages. Persian administrative practices influence Greek governance. Greek philosophy and literature influence Persian-educated classes. Architecture, art, cuisine all show increasing mixing of styles. Religion proves surprisingly adaptable. Alexander maintains his policy of toleration, allowing each people to worship their own gods while sometimes promoting syncretism. Zeus is identified with Ahura Mazda, Heracles with various local heroes, Aphrodite with Ishtar. The practice irritates religious purists, but helps create common ground. Alexander himself, having been declared son of Zeus Ammon, encourages divine honors. Temples to Alexander the god appear in various cities, a practice that horrifies traditionalist Greeks, but fits comfortably with Persian and Egyptian concepts of divine kingship. The legal system is reformed to accommodate the empire's diversity. Different peoples are allowed to keep their own laws for internal matters. Greek cities maintain their traditional legal codes. Jewish communities follow Mosaic law. Persian regions apply Persian customs. But an overarching imperial law handles disputes between members of different communities and crimes against the state. This legal pluralism is complex but necessary given the empire's ethnic diversity. Education receives particular attention as Alexander ages and thinks about legacy. He establishes a school in each regional capital, modelled on the Lyceum where Aristotle taught, to educate the sons of the elite from all peoples. The curriculum combines Greek philosophy and literature with Persian history and administration, mathematics and science from various traditions, military training, and multiple languages. The goal is to create a new generation of imperial administrators who understand different cultures and see themselves as serving the empire rather than any particular ethnicity. His own sons are educated in this system, studying alongside children of Persian nobles, Greek aristocrats, Roman senators, and others. Alexander IV, the eldest, is now approaching manhood and showing both promise and problems. He is intelligent and well-educated, speaks Greek, Persian, and Latin fluently, understands military tactics and administration, but he is also arrogant, convinced of his divine heritage, impatient with the careful diplomacy that holds the empire together. He is very much his father's son, with all that implies both good and bad. The younger sons are still being trained, each showing different aptitudes and temperaments. Alexander assigns them different mentors from among his companions, exposing them to different perspectives and expertise. He is trying to avoid the succession crises that destroyed so many kingdoms, but he is also creating potential rivals. Multiple sons of a great king, each trained for power, each with supporters among the military and nobility. This is a recipe for civil war if not carefully managed. By 302 BCE, when Alexander is 51 years old, the empire has achieved a degree of stability unimaginable during the conquest years. The provinces are reasonably well governed, taxes flow regularly, trade flourishes, major rebellions are rare. The quadripartite capital system functions adequately, the regional rulers maintaining order while acknowledging Alexander's supremacy. The cultural synthesis proceeds gradually, creating a cosmopolitan elite that, while not fully integrated, can at least work together. Yet the empire remains fundamentally fragile. Everything still depends too much on Alexander personally. The regional rulers are loyal because he lives and can enforce their loyalty. The Persian nobility accept Macedonian rule because resistance is futile while Alexander commands the armies. The various peoples tolerate each other because imperial authority prevents ethnic violence. What happens when Alexander dies? Will the institutions he has created be strong enough to maintain unity? Or will the empire fragment despite his efforts? These questions occupy Alexander's thoughts increasingly as he enters his 50s. His health continues to decline. The old wounds ache constantly. His breathing is labored from the lung damage. He tires easily. He can still ride and review troops, can still make public appearances that project strength and authority. But privately, he knows his time is limited. Perhaps a decade more, perhaps less. He must use that time to ensure his legacy survives him. The succession looms as the critical issue. Alexander IV is the obvious heir, the eldest son, already in his late teens, and being gradually introduced to governance. But giving him full power immediately would be dangerous. He lacks experience and judgment, yet waiting too long risks Alexander IV becoming impatient, perhaps attempting to seize power while his father lives. The Roman example of fathers and sons sharing power, with clear succession arrangements, appeals to Alexander. He begins formally associating Alexander IV with imperial rule, having him attend councils, giving him administrative responsibilities, gradually preparing him for the moment when he will rule alone. But succession cannot be simply father to son in an empire this diverse. The regional capitals, the different ethnic groups, the various factions of the military and nobility, all need to be considered. Alexander begins planning a formal succession arrangement that will hopefully prevent civil war. His younger sons will be given subordinate roles under Alexander IV, ruling specific regions while acknowledging the eldest as supreme emperor. The system is modelled partly on the Achaemenid Persian practice, partly on his own quadripartite capital arrangement. Whether it will work is uncertain, but it is better than leaving succession to chance and violence. As the decade of the 300s BCE begins, Alexander can look back on 3 decades of rule since his near death in Babylon. He has conquered the known world, created an empire larger than any before, attempted cultural synthesis on an unprecedented scale. He has matured from impetuous youth to experienced ruler, has seen his sons grow toward adulthood, has built institutions intended to outlast him. He is 50 years old, grey-haired and scarred, still commanding but no longer young, still ambitious but increasingly concerned with preservation rather than expansion. The final decade of his life awaits, and with it the ultimate test of whether his empire can survive its creator. The succession question. The year 300 BCE finds Alexander at a crossroads not of geography but of legacy. He is 53 years old, an age that in the ancient world marks definite old age, especially for a body as damaged as his. He has ruled for 37 years, conquered for 32, and transformed the world more completely than any man before him. But the question that increasingly haunts him is not what he has accomplished, but what will remain after he dies. Alexander IV is now 23 years old, a man by any standard, and clamouring for real power. He has been gradually introduced to governance, has governed provinces under supervision, has commanded armies in minor campaigns, has attended councils and learned administration. He is intelligent, charismatic, educated in multiple cultures and languages, everything a cosmopolitan emperor should be. But he is also arrogant, impulsive, convinced of his divine right to rule, and impatient with his father's careful balancing of interests. He wants to prove himself through conquest, to add to his father's achievements, rather than merely preserve them. The tension between father and son grows through the early 300s BCE. Alexander IV believes he is ready to rule, that his father is holding him back out of pride or fear of being surpassed. Alexander the Elder knows his son is not ready, that he lacks the judgment and patience that ruling an empire requires. But he also recognizes that waiting too long could provoke rebellion, that a frustrated heir is dangerous. The solution he devises is a formal co-regency, similar to arrangements used by Roman emperors in later centuries and by some Persian kings. In 299 BCE, at a great ceremony in Babylon, attended by representatives from across the empire, Alexander formally elevates his eldest son to co-emperor. Alexander IV will rule jointly with his father, with specific responsibilities for the Western territories, while Alexander the Elder maintains oversight of the East. It is a compromise that satisfies no one completely, but prevents open conflict. The younger Alexander gets real power and the prestige of imperial title. The elder Alexander maintains ultimate authority and can intervene if necessary. The arrangement works reasonably well initially. Alexander IV throws himself into governing the Western territories with energy and some success. He tours the Western provinces, personally hearing petitions, reviewing troops, inspecting fortifications. He proves himself capable of administration, if occasionally hasty in judgment. He also continues his father's policy of founding cities, establishing several new Alexandrias in Spain and North Africa. His ambitions are transparent. He wants his own legacy of conquests and foundations, not merely to be remembered as his father's son. But the co-regency also exposes tensions in the empire that Alexander the Elder's personal authority had suppressed. Regional governors, unclear about which emperor they should obey in specific situations, sometimes play one against the other. Greek cities, hoping to regain independence, try to exploit the division of authority. Persian nobles wonder whether the succession arrangement means the empire will be formally divided, and if so, whether they might regain independence. The very arrangement intended to ensure smooth succession creates uncertainty that destabilizes the empire. Alexander's younger sons add further complications. They are now young men themselves, trained for power, each with their own ambitions and supporters. The second son, born to Statera and named Darius in honor of his maternal grandfather, governs Persia under Alexander's supervision and cultivates support among the Persian nobility by emphasizing his Persian heritage. The third son, Heracles, born to Barcine and more Greek in temperament, has a military command and the support of Macedonian veterans who find Alexander IV too foreign. The fourth son, a child of Parysatis named Artaxerxes, is being groomed for administration and diplomatic service. This multiplicity of potential heirs is both strength and danger. If something happens to Alexander IV, there are clear alternatives, preventing succession crises. But multiple claimants with their own power bases and supporters is exactly the situation that leads to civil wars. Alexander knows this. He remembers the wars of the Diadochi from our timeline's history, though in this alternate timeline, those wars never happened because he lived. He is desperately trying to prevent similar conflicts after his own death. His solution is to formalize the division of the empire among his sons while maintaining overall unity. In 297 BCE, he issues a formal succession decree, carefully crafted after years of thought and consultation with advisors. The decree establishes Alexander IV as supreme emperor, ruling from Babylon. Darius will rule Persia and the eastern territories as a subordinate king, acknowledging Alexander IV's supremacy, but with considerable autonomy. Heracles will rule Macedonia and Greece. Artaxerxes will govern Egypt and North Africa. The western Mediterranean territories will be divided between Alexander IV and Heracles. The system is modelled on the Persian satrapy system, on the quadripartite capital arrangement Alexander established earlier, and on his own experience with regional governance. Each son will have real power within his territory, but will acknowledge the eldest as supreme. They will support each other militarily, maintain unified foreign policy, and avoid warfare against each other. In theory, it prevents both tyrannical centralization and complete fragmentation. In practice, the decree satisfies almost no one. Alexander IV resents having to share the empire with his brothers, believing as eldest and most capable, he should rule undivided. Darius and the others resent being subordinate to their brother, especially since they govern territories as large as most kingdoms. The Macedonian military traditionalists hate the idea of divided rule, seeing it as Persian influence corrupting Macedonian values. The Persian nobility see it as Greeks maintaining control by dividing the spoils among themselves. Yet the decree is promulgated, and because Alexander still lives and still commands ultimate authority, it is accepted. The empire does not fragment immediately, because everyone understands that while the great king lives, rebellion is futile. But the decree also makes clear that Alexander is planning for his death, acknowledging his mortality in ways he never did as a young conqueror. This creates its own psychological effects. Provincial governors begin positioning themselves for the post-Alexander world. Ambitious generals cultivate relationships with the sons. Ethnic groups plan for scenarios where they might regain independence. Alexander spends his remaining years trying to make the succession arrangement work, trying to bind his sons to each other through shared interests and family loyalty. He arranges marriages between his sons and daughters of his companions, creating kinship networks that should prevent warfare. He rotates them through different administrative positions, giving each experience in different parts of the empire. He publicly mediates their disputes, trying to set precedents for how they should handle conflicts after he dies. He also writes, an activity that surprises those who knew the young Alexander. The aging emperor produces a series of letters and memoranda to his sons, containing advice on governance, warfare, dealing with different peoples, and maintaining unity. These documents, preserved and copied throughout the empire, become known as the Testaments of Alexander and will influence rulers for centuries. They reveal a man very different from the impetuous youth who charged across the Granicus, a man who has learned patience, subtlety, and the limits of force. In these testaments, Alexander acknowledges his mistakes. He admits that his early cultural imperialism, his demands for proskynesis and divine honors, his impatience with Persian customs, created unnecessary resistance. He admits that his excessive drinking and volcanic temper harmed his cause. He admits that his neglect of administrative development during the conquest years created problems that took decades to address. These admissions are remarkable for a man who throughout his life has been convinced of his divine destiny and infallibility. He also expresses his vision for the empire's future. He wants his sons to continue the work of cultural synthesis, to create a genuinely universal civilization that transcends ethnic divisions. He warns against favoring Greeks over others or vice versa, insisting that merit and loyalty should determine promotion regardless of origin. He emphasizes the importance of law, administration, and economic development over military glory. He advises his sons to campaign only when necessary, not for glory but for security and genuine need. Most poignantly, he reflects on whether his conquests were worth their cost. Hundreds of thousands have died in his wars. Cities have been destroyed, peoples displaced, traditional ways of life disrupted. He has transformed the world, but at terrible price. Was the cost worth the achievement? In his testaments, Alexander does not clearly answer this question. Perhaps he himself is uncertain, but he urges his sons to make their rule gentler than his conquest, to heal rather than wound, to build rather than destroy. As Alexander enters his late 50s, his health deteriorates noticeably. The old wounds accumulated over decades cause constant pain. His breathing difficulties worsen, legacy of the arrow in his lung. He develops recurring fevers, possibly malaria or another chronic infection, that leave him weakened for weeks at a time. He can no longer travel extensively or appear at long public ceremonies. Increasingly, he governs from his palace, receiving reports, issuing orders, managing the empire through correspondence and deputies. Yet his mind remains sharp, and his authority remains absolute. Even bedridden, he is still Alexander, and his will is law. But everyone can see he is dying, not suddenly as in 323 BCE, but gradually. inexorably. The succession that he has tried so carefully to arrange will soon be tested. Whether his sons will honor their agreements, whether the empire will hold together, whether his life's work will survive him, all this remains uncertain as Alexander approaches the end. In 294 BCE, Alexander celebrated his 60th birthday with a modest ceremony in Babylon. He is now an old man by ancient standards, grey-haired and bent, moving with difficulty, often in pain. But he has lived to see his sons grown and in power, has created an empire that has endured for 3 decades, has attempted the fusion of civilizations that was his grandest ambition. Whether he has succeeded or merely postponed the inevitable fragmentation, only time will tell. But he has achieved something no other conqueror has. He has lived long enough to try to make his conquests permanent. The final years await, and with them the ultimate test of Alexander's legacy. But first, we must understand how this alternate history has affected the wider world, how the butterfly effects of Alexander's extended life have reshaped civilizations far from the Mediterranean, how choices made in Babylon and Alexandria have influenced events in India, China, and beyond. Butterfly effects on world history. The direct consequences of Alexander's extended reign are clear. A united Mediterranean world under Greco-Macedonian rule, attempted cultural synthesis across Eurasia, altered power dynamics throughout the ancient world. But the indirect consequences, the butterfly effects that ripple outward from this change in history, are equally profound and reach into regions Alexander never personally touched. Let us begin with India, which Alexander invaded in our timeline but only briefly. In the actual history, Alexander's invasion of India was limited to the Punjab region. After his army refused to march further at the Hyphasis River, he withdrew, leaving behind a few garrisons and governors. Within a few years of his death, Chandragupta Maurya expelled the Macedonian forces and founded the Mauryan Empire, which united most of the Indian subcontinent for the first time. This empire, under Chandragupta's grandson Ashoka, became one of history's great civilizations, spreading Buddhism and creating a sophisticated administration. In our alternate timeline, Alexander's survival changes this trajectory. The territories he conquered in India remain under firmer control, garrisoned by larger forces, integrated more thoroughly into his empire. The governors he left behind, instead of being isolated and eventually expelled, received support from the broader imperial system. Trade routes between India and the Mediterranean developed more extensively, with caravans and ships carrying goods and ideas in both directions. Chandragupta Maurya still rises to power in the Gangetic Plain, but he faces a very different situation. Instead of weak, isolated Greek governors in Punjab, he faces the might of Alexander's empire. His attempts to expand westward are blocked by Macedonian forces backed by the empire's vast resources. The Mauryan Empire that emerges in this timeline is consequently smaller, limited to the Gangetic Valley and central India, unable to unify the entire subcontinent. The cultural consequences are significant. In our timeline, Buddhism spread from India across Asia, carried by Mauryan missionaries and traders. In this alternate timeline, with reduced Mauryan power and stronger Greek presence in northwestern India, the spread of Buddhism is more limited. The religion remains important in India, but does not expand as rapidly into Central Asia, China, and Southeast Asia. Instead, Greek philosophical and religious ideas penetrate deeper into India, creating a more extensive Indo-Greek synthesis than occurred in our timeline. This Greco-Indian fusion produces remarkable results in philosophy and science. Indian mathematical concepts, including the decimal system and the concept of zero, combine with Greek geometry and logic. Indian astronomy, already sophisticated, encounters Greek astronomical theories, producing advances that neither tradition would achieve alone. Philosophical exchanges occur as Greek thinkers encounter Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, leading to new synthetic systems that combine Platonic metaphysics with Indian concepts of karma and reincarnation. The artistic synthesis is equally striking. Greek sculptural naturalism influences Indian religious art, producing representations of Buddha and Hindu deities in Greek-influenced styles. Indian decorative traditions influence Greek art in the Eastern Empire, introducing new patterns and iconography. Architecture combines Greek columns and mathematical proportions with Indian elaborate carvings and monumental scale. The result is a distinctive Indo-Greek artistic tradition that spreads throughout the Eastern Empire. Moving further east, the effects reach China, though more indirectly. In our timeline, the Qin dynasty united China in 221 BCE, roughly a century after Alexander's death, creating the first imperial Chinese state. The Qin and subsequent Han dynasty developed largely in isolation from Mediterranean influences, creating distinctly Chinese institutions and culture. The Silk Road, which eventually connected China to the West, developed gradually over centuries, with limited cultural exchange initially. In the alternate timeline, with Alexander's empire stretching deep into Central Asia and maintaining stronger control over the region, the Silk Road develops earlier and more extensively. Chinese silk reaches Mediterranean markets in larger quantities, and Mediterranean goods reach China. More importantly, ideas begin to flow more freely. Chinese officials become aware of the vast Western Empire, of different political systems and philosophical traditions. Greek astronomical and mathematical knowledge reaches China through intermediaries. The exchange is not one-directional. Chinese innovations also flow westward. Chinese paper-making technology, silk production techniques, and administrative practices influence the eastern parts of Alexander's empire. Bactrian Greeks and Persians who trade with China bring back information about Chinese civilization that fascinates Alexander's successors and their educated subjects. The result is increased connectivity across Eurasia, with Alexander's empire serving as a bridge between East and West. The development of the Qin dynasty itself is affected by these contacts. Chinese military technologies, particularly in cavalry warfare, are influenced by encounters with Greco-Macedonian forces along the western frontiers. Chinese administrative systems, already sophisticated, adopt some elements of the Macedonian provincial governance system. These are subtle influences, not transformative ones, but they affect China's development in ways that accumulate over time. More dramatically, Alexander's empire affects the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, who were crucial in our timeline's history. The Xiongnu Confederation, which in our timeline would become a major power and eventually push westward, triggering migrations that contributed to the Roman Empire's fall, faces different circumstances. The stronger Macedonian presence in Central Asia contains Xiongnu expansion more effectively. The nomadic peoples still raid and sometimes penetrate imperial frontiers, but they cannot build the kind of large-scale confederation that would threaten civilized regions as completely as in our timeline. This containment has long-term effects. The great migrations that in our timeline swept across Eurasia in the late classical and early medieval periods, bringing Huns, Goths, and other peoples crashing against Rome's frontiers, do not happen in the same way or scale. The alternate timeline's history is consequently more stable, with fewer massive disruptions caused by nomadic invasions. This stability allows for more continuous cultural and technological development in settled civilizations. In the Middle East, the Jewish community develops under very different circumstances. In our timeline, the Seleucid dynasty's attempt to Hellenize Jerusalem provoked the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BCE, which led to a period of Jewish independence, which eventually led to conflict with Rome and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. These events shaped Judaism profoundly, leading to the development of Rabbinic Judaism and the diaspora culture that defined Jewish identity for 2 millennia. In the alternate timeline, with Alexander living and his empire more stable, the cultural pressures on Judaism are both more intense and more subtle. Hellenization proceeds more gradually, without the kind of forced imposition that provoked revolt. Jewish communities throughout the empire become more integrated into Greco-Persian culture while maintaining religious distinctiveness. The philosophical Judaism represented by thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, who in our timeline tried to synthesize Greek philosophy with Jewish scripture, becomes more mainstream in this alternate history. This has profound implications for Christianity's emergence. In our timeline, Jesus lived and preached in Roman-occupied Judea in the 1st century CE, roughly 300 years after Alexander's death. His message drew on Jewish prophetic tradition, apocalyptic expectations shaped by Roman oppression, and was spread through networks of Greek-speaking diaspora Jews using concepts from Greek philosophy to explain Jewish messianism to Gentile audiences. In the alternate timeline, with Judaism more integrated into a Greco-Persian cultural synthesis, with less intense Roman oppression, because Rome is itself part of Alexander's successor empire rather than an independent power, the conditions that produced Christianity, as we know it, do not exist. A messianic movement might still emerge from Judaism, but it would take different forms, emphasize different aspects of Jewish tradition, and spread through different networks. Christianity, if it emerges at all, would be unrecognizable compared to the religion we know. The absence of Christianity as we know it is perhaps the most profound butterfly effect of all. Christianity shaped Western civilization in ways too numerous to catalogue. Medieval institutions, Renaissance art, Reformation politics, modern moral philosophy, all were influenced by Christian theology and institutions. A world without this specific form of Christianity is a radically different world, one where Western identity, values, and culture develop along entirely different trajectories. Islam faces similar questions. Muhammad's prophetic career in 7th century Arabia drew on existing religious traditions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, and responded to specific political and social conditions in the Arabian Peninsula. In our alternate timeline, with Arabia conquered by Alexander and integrated into his empire centuries earlier, the religious and political landscape of 7th century Arabia would be utterly different. Islam, which in our timeline became one of the world's great religions and civilizations, might not emerge at all, or might emerge in unrecognizable form. The technological development of humanity as a whole is affected by Alexander's extended reign and the longer-lasting unified empire it creates. In our timeline, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE led to a period in Western Europe of reduced literacy, limited trade, fragmented political authority, and slower technological progress. The knowledge of the classical world was partly lost, preserved mainly in the Byzantine East and the Islamic world, only to be rediscovered by Western Europe during the Renaissance. In the alternate timeline, if Alexander's empire or its successor states maintain greater stability and continuity, this knowledge need never be lost. The libraries, schools, and scholarly institutions that Alexander established, and that his successors maintained, could preserve and build upon ancient knowledge continuously. Scientific and technological progress might accelerate as Greek theoretical science combines with Persian, Indian, and Chinese practical knowledge without the disruptions of civilizational collapse. This could lead to earlier development of crucial technologies. The steam engine, which in our timeline was not developed until the 18th century, despite ancient Greeks and Romans understanding the principle, might be developed centuries earlier if continuous technical progress were maintained. Maritime technologies could advance faster with sustained trade and navigation across the Indian Ocean. Agricultural improvements could spread more quickly through an integrated empire. Medical knowledge could accumulate more systematically, or perhaps not. Technological progress depends not just on knowledge preservation, but on economic incentives, social structures, and often on specific individuals' genius. A more stable, unified ancient world might actually be more conservative. less driven to innovate than the competitive, fragmented world of our timeline. The question of whether Alexander's extended reign accelerates or retards human progress is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that the world of 294 BCE, when Alexander celebrates his 60th birthday, is radically different from our timeline's world at the same date. There is no Roman Republic conquering the Mediterranean. There is no Carthage as an independent power. There are no Hellenistic kingdoms fighting endless wars. India's history has diverged. China's development has been influenced by earlier Western contacts, and the religious landscape of the Middle East has been transformed. The entire structure of ancient civilization has been reshaped by one man's survival of an illness that should have killed him, and the reshaping continues beyond his lifetime. The world that Alexander's successors inherit, the problems they must solve, the opportunities they can exploit, all derive from choices made decades earlier in Babylon when a fever broke and a young king survived. As we turn now to explore how this alternate world might have evolved into modernity, we must understand that every subsequent development, every civilization, every historical event, builds on foundations laid by Alexander's extended reign. The long shadow, our world transformed. Alexander dies in 293 BCE, in Babylon, in the same palace where he nearly died 30 years earlier. He is 62 years old, and his death is not sudden but gradual, the slow failing of a body that has endured too much. His sons are present, as are his surviving companions, now old men themselves. He dies knowing that he has done everything possible to ensure his empire's survival, that he has built institutions and trained successors, that he has transformed the world more completely than any man before him. Whether it is enough, he cannot know. Death claims even Alexander, and the answer to his life's great question, whether his empire will outlast him, must wait for history's judgment. The immediate aftermath is tense, but not catastrophic. The succession arrangement that Alexander established holds, at least initially. Alexander IV becomes supreme emperor, ruling from Babylon, while his brothers govern their assigned territories. There are disputes, power struggles, moments when civil war seems inevitable. But the structures their father built, the habits of cooperation he instilled, the fear of destroying what has been created, all this prevents immediate fragmentation. Over the following decades and centuries, the empire evolves in ways Alexander could not have predicted. The succession system he established, with multiple rulers acknowledging one supreme emperor, gradually transforms into something more federal. The regional rulers gain increasing autonomy, become almost independent kings, but maintain nominal allegiance to the supreme emperor in Babylon. It resembles the later Byzantine Empire's relationship with various successor states, or perhaps the Holy Roman Empire, where unity is more theoretical than practical, but still meaningful. The empire never collapses in the catastrophic way that the Western Roman Empire did in our timeline. There is no single fall date, no dramatic conquest by barbarians. Instead, there is gradual evolution and occasional partition, followed by reunification, followed by further evolution. The basic structure, a multi-ethnic empire claiming universal authority and maintaining Greco-Persian cultural synthesis, persists for over 1,000 years, eventually fragmenting into multiple successor states that nonetheless share common cultural roots. The long-term cultural consequences are profound. The fusion of Greek and Persian civilizations that Alexander promoted, which in our timeline occurred partially and temporarily in the Hellenistic kingdoms, in this alternate timeline, has centuries to develop into something genuinely integrated. Greek philosophical rationalism combines with Persian administrative sophistication and religious depth. The resulting culture is neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something new, a synthesis that becomes the foundation for a distinct civilization. This Greco-Persian synthesis spreads far beyond the empire's political boundaries. Just as Hellenistic culture influenced Rome, Parthia, and eventually even China in our timeline, This deeper synthesis influences surrounding civilizations even more profoundly. The Indian subcontinent, in close contact with the empire's eastern provinces, absorbs significant Greek and Persian influences. China, trading extensively with the empire via overland and maritime routes, encounters Western ideas much earlier and more systematically than in our timeline. The religious landscape develops entirely differently. Without the Roman Empire as we know it, without the specific political circumstances that allowed Christianity to emerge and spread, without the Islamic conquests that in our timeline reshaped the Middle East and Mediterranean, the religious map is unrecognizable. Zoroastrianism, given official support by Alexander's successors and synthesized with Greek philosophical concepts, becomes a major world religion rather than declining into obscurity. Jewish communities, integrated into the empire but maintaining religious distinctiveness, develop forms of Judaism that blend Hellenic philosophy with scriptural tradition more thoroughly than in our timeline. New religions emerge from this cultural mixing, a synthetic faith combining Zoroastrian dualism, Greek rational theology, and local traditions spreads across the empire, offering ethical monotheism without the ethnic exclusivity of Judaism or the later claims of Christianity and Islam. This religion, which we might call imperial syncretism, provides common religious ground for the empire's diverse peoples while allowing local variations and private devotions to traditional gods. The absence of Christianity and Islam, as we know them, is perhaps the single most profound difference between this alternate timeline and our own. These religions shaped billions of lives, inspired great art and literature, motivated exploration and conquest, provided ethical frameworks for societies. Without them, humanity develops different religious traditions, draws on different spiritual resources, builds different institutions. Medieval Christendom, the Islamic Golden Age, the Reformation, all the vast historical movements driven by these religions simply do not occur. What replaces them? The alternate timeline has its own religious developments, its own prophets and teachers, its own sacred texts and theological disputes, but we cannot name them or describe them in detail because they arise from circumstances too different from our own history to predict specifically. We can say only that humanity, being human, creates meaning and seeks transcendence in every timeline, that religious impulses express themselves in different forms, but remain fundamental to human experience. The political evolution of the alternate timeline produces structures different from our nation-states. The long persistence of Alexander's empire, even in evolved federal form, creates a concept of universal empire that never entirely disappears. When the empire finally fragments definitively, perhaps around 800–1000 CE by our calendar, the successor states still see themselves as parts of a larger whole, maintaining cultural connections and sometimes seeking to restore imperial unity. This resembles the medieval European concept of Christendom, but without the religious specificity, based instead on shared Greco-Persian cultural heritage. These successor states develop governmental forms that blend Alexander's administrative legacy with local traditions. Some are monarchies claiming descent from Alexander's dynasty. Others are aristocratic republics modeled partly on the Roman Republic and partly on Greek city-state institutions. A few experiment with forms of representative government, creating assemblies that include multiple classes and ethnic groups. The political diversity is considerable, but all share certain common features: administrative sophistication, legal systems based on imperial precedents, cosmopolitan culture that values multiple traditions. The technological trajectory diverges significantly from our timeline. The continuous preservation of ancient knowledge, without the dramatic collapse and rediscovery cycle that characterized Western Europe, allows for steadier progress. Mathematical and scientific traditions develop without interruption, building on foundations laid by Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese thinkers. The lack of religious dogmatism that in our timeline sometimes hindered scientific inquiry combined with patronage from rulers interested in practical applications, creates favorable conditions for innovation. Specific technological advances are impossible to predict with confidence, but we can identify general trends. Navigation and maritime technology develop rapidly, driven by extensive seaborne trade across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Astronomical knowledge advances steadily, supported by continuous observation and theoretical work. Medicine progresses through systematic study and cross-cultural exchange of knowledge. Agricultural techniques improve through careful experimentation and spread of best practices. Metallurgy and material science benefit from sustained research and development. The question of whether industrialization occurs earlier, later, or at all in this alternate timeline is fascinating but uncertain. The Industrial Revolution in our timeline required specific combinations of factors: available capital, labor markets, technological knowledge, economic incentives, cultural attitudes toward innovation and work. Some of these factors might be more favorable in the alternate timeline, particularly preserved knowledge and available capital. Others might be less favorable, particularly if the more stable social order creates fewer incentives for labor-saving technology. If industrialization does occur, it likely looks different from our timeline's version. It might develop more gradually, spread more evenly across regions, produce less dramatic social disruption, or it might occur in different regions entirely, perhaps in the eastern parts of the former empire that maintain closer contact with Chinese and Indian technological traditions. The social and political consequences would differ as well, responding to different existing structures and cultural values. The exploration and colonization of the Americas presents another fascinating divergence point. In our timeline, European discovery of the Americas in 1492 was followed by devastating colonization that destroyed indigenous civilizations and created the modern Western Hemisphere. In the alternate timeline, with different political structures, different religious motivations, and potentially different technologies, the encounter between old and new worlds would unfold differently. Maritime technology might advance earlier in the alternate timeline, given the extensive seaborne trade networks. Explorers from the Greco-Persian successor states, or from the more developed African civilizations in this timeline, or even from Chinese or Indian sailors, might reach the Americas earlier than 1492. The motivations would differ too. Without Christian missionary zeal, and without the specific economic pressures of early modern Europe, the conquest and colonization might be less brutal, more focused on trade than settlement, allowing indigenous civilizations more time to adapt and resist. Or perhaps the discovery comes later, when old world civilizations are more advanced and the power imbalance even greater. Or perhaps it never occurs, and the Americas develop independently for even longer. The interactions between old and new worlds, whenever and however they occur, shape both hemispheres profoundly. The diseases that in our timeline killed 90% of indigenous Americans might still be devastating, or improved medical knowledge might mitigate the impact. The crops and resources of the Americas that transformed old world economies, potatoes and maize and silver, still flow eastward, but through different channels and with different consequences. The modern world that emerges from this alternate history by the year 2000 or 2025 is fundamentally unrecognizable to us. The political map shows different states with different borders, products of different wars and treaties and historical developments. The cultural landscape reflects different religious traditions, different philosophical schools, different artistic movements. The languages people speak have evolved from different roots, incorporate different influences, express different conceptual frameworks. Technology in this alternate present might be more or less advanced than our own, depending on how the various factors played out over 2 millennia. Perhaps continuous knowledge preservation and cross-cultural exchange produced more rapid progress, leading to a 2025 that is more technologically sophisticated than ours. Perhaps the greater stability and conservatism of an imperial system hindered innovation, producing a 2025 that is less advanced. Perhaps progress was similar, but in different directions, with advanced technologies in fields we neglected and primitive technologies in fields we developed. The values and ideals of this alternate modern world differ profoundly from ours. The concepts of human rights, individual liberty, and democracy that we cherish developed from specific historical experiences. Greek democracy, Roman law, Christian theology, Enlightenment philosophy. In the alternate timeline, with different foundational experiences, different values emerge. Perhaps collective harmony is prioritized over individual freedom. Perhaps ethnic diversity is more accepted because the Greco-Persian synthesis made it normative from the beginning. Perhaps attitudes toward authority and hierarchy differ because of the long imperial tradition. This does not mean the alternate world is better or worse than ours in any absolute sense. Human flourishing and suffering exist in every timeline. Justice and injustice, creativity and destruction, love and hate, all the fundamental aspects of human experience persist regardless of political systems or cultural traditions. The alternate world has its own achievements to celebrate and its own crimes to mourn, its own heroes and villains, its own golden ages and dark periods. What we can say with confidence is that it is different, unimaginably different. The clothes people wear, the food they eat, the buildings they inhabit, the stories they tell, the gods they worship, the languages they speak, the technologies they use, the governments they live under, all fundamentally alien to someone from our timeline. Even human thought might be structured differently, shaped by different philosophical traditions and conceptual frameworks, leading people to perceive and organize reality in ways we would find strange. Consider something as fundamental as how history itself is understood and remembered. In our timeline, we see history largely through a Western lens, as progress from primitive to advanced, from tyranny to freedom, with certain civilizations and individuals playing heroic roles. The alternate timeline would have its own historical narrative, its own heroes and turning points, its own sense of progress or cycles or decline. Alexander's extended reign and the empire he built would be the foundational story, the equivalent of our Roman Empire or Age of Discovery, the period that defined everything that followed. Our own existence, the specific individuals reading or hearing this, would not exist in the alternate timeline. The countless accidents of conception and birth that led to each of us depend on specific historical circumstances. Change those circumstances and different people are born. The alternate 2025 has roughly similar human population, faces similar challenges of resource allocation and environmental sustainability, but the specific individuals are entirely different. You and I, as we are products of our specific timeline and could not exist in another. This thought experiment, following the alternate path from Alexander's survival in Babylon to a modern world unrecognizable from our own, demonstrates the profound contingency of history. The world we live in, which seems so solid and inevitable, is actually the product of countless accidents and individual choices. A fever that broke, a battle that was won, a political compromise that held, all these small hinges on which vast doors swung. Change any of them, and everything changes. The implications are both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals how little control we have over large historical forces. How much depends on chance and circumstance beyond anyone's ability to predict or manage. Empowering because it shows that individuals and their choices do matter, that history is not predetermined, that different futures are always possible. As we conclude this long journey through what might have been, we return to where we began, Babylon in 323 BCE, watching as Alexander fights for his life. In our timeline, he lost that fight, and his empire fragmented into the Hellenistic kingdoms that shaped the ancient Mediterranean until Rome conquered them. In the alternate timeline we have explored, he won that fight, and 30 more years of his rule reshaped the world in ways that echo across millennia. Which timeline is better? The question is meaningless. Both contain human achievement and human suffering, glory and tragedy, wisdom and folly. Both demonstrate humanity's capacity for greatness and for terrible cruelty. Both show civilizations rising and falling, knowledge being created and lost and rediscovered. Individuals struggling to find meaning and purpose in complex societies. What the exercise teaches us is not that one historical path is superior to another, but that the path we are on is not inevitable. The world could be different, history could have turned otherwise. And most importantly, the future is not predetermined. The choices we make, individually and collectively, shape what comes next. Just as choices made centuries ago shaped our present. We are not passengers in history but participants, and the roads ahead fork in countless directions. Conclusion and reflection. The sun sets over Babylon for the final time in our story. It is 293 BCE, and Alexander the Great has breathed his last. But the empire he built through 3 decades of extended life and rule continues, his sons governing the vast territories he conquered and consolidated, the institutions he created functioning to maintain order across 3 continents. The world he leaves behind is profoundly different from the one he inherited, transformed by his vision and will, shaped by his genius and his flaws. Standing here at the conclusion of this alternate history, we can appreciate the staggering scale of what Alexander achieved in our imagined extension of his life. In the 30 years after his recovery from the illness that killed him in our timeline, he conquered the Western Mediterranean, subdued Carthage and Rome, secured the northern frontiers against Scythian raids, administered an empire from the Atlantic to India, attempted cultural synthesis on an unprecedented scale, raised sons and prepared them for rule, and built governmental structures intended to outlast him. The alternate Alexander we have followed is both the same and different from the historical figure. He retains the brilliant military mind, the charisma, the ambition that made him great, but survival and aging have added dimensions the young conqueror lacked. Patience, administrative sophistication, concern for legacy, willingness to compromise. The impetuous youth who charged into battle becomes the calculating emperor who builds institutions. The man who demanded divine honors becomes the father who writes testaments of wisdom for his sons. Growth and change are possible even for world conquerors, yet some things remain constant. Alexander never loses his fundamental drive for glory, never stops seeking new challenges, never truly accepts limits on his ambitions. Even in old age, planning for succession and worrying about institutional stability, he dreams of further conquests. The warrior remains at his core, restless and hungry for achievement. This is both his greatness and his curse, the source of his extraordinary accomplishments and of the empire's underlying fragility. The question that haunts this alternate history is whether Alexander succeeded in his ultimate goal, creating something permanent. Did the extra 30 years allow him to transform ephemeral conquest into lasting civilization? Or did he merely postpone the inevitable fragmentation, delay by a generation the wars that his absence would trigger? The answer, as always in history, is complex and ambiguous. In some ways, he clearly succeeded. The cultural synthesis he promoted, the Greco-Persian fusion that became the foundation for a distinct civilization, was a genuine achievement that outlasted his political empire. The cities he founded remained centers of culture and commerce for centuries. The administrative systems he developed influenced later states and empires. The idea of universal empire that he embodied shaped political thought for millennia. These are real and lasting accomplishments. In other ways, failure was inevitable. No political structure, however carefully designed, can completely prevent the ambitions and conflicts that drive human societies. No empire, however vast and powerful, lasts forever. Alexander's sons, despite his careful preparation, fought among themselves. His institutions, despite their sophistication, eventually proved unable to maintain unity across such vast and diverse territories. The empire he built did eventually fragment, though perhaps more slowly and less catastrophically than in our timeline. The deeper question is whether success or failure is even the right framework for evaluating Alexander's legacy. He set out to conquer the world, to achieve glory surpassing all who came before, to make his mark on history so deeply that he would never be forgotten. By these measures, he succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. He transformed the ancient world, influenced the development of civilizations he never saw, and ensured his name would echo through ages. That the specific political structure he created did not last forever is almost irrelevant to these deeper achievements. The exercise of constructing this alternate history reveals important truths about history itself and about the human condition. First, it demonstrates how contingent historical outcomes are, how much depends on individual lives and random events. Alexander's survival in Babylon was not foreordained. The fever could have taken him, as it did in our timeline. That it did not, in this imagined history, changes everything that follows. This reminds us that our own history, which seems so solid and inevitable, is actually one possibility among many. Second, it shows the limits of individual agency even for the greatest historical figures. Alexander could conquer cities and defeat armies, could command millions and reshape cultures, but he could not fully control what happened after his death or ensure his vision would be perfectly realized. Even extraordinary individuals are constrained by human nature, by the complexity of societies, by the unpredictability of events. Recognizing these limits is not defeatism, but realism, understanding both what is possible and what is not. Third, it illustrates that progress and decline are not simple or unidirectional. The alternate history contains both achievements and disasters, periods of enlightenment and periods of darkness, just as our own timeline does. The continuous preservation of ancient knowledge might have advanced some fields while cultural conservatism hindered others. The unified empire might have promoted peace in some regions while imposing tyranny in others. History is always mixed, always ambiguous, always containing both good and evil consequences of every major development. Fourth, it reminds us that different does not mean better or worse. The alternate world we have explored is fundamentally different from our own, with different civilizations, religions, values, and technologies. But it is not obviously superior or inferior. It has its own achievements and failures, its own heroes and villains. The human experience, in all its complexity and contradiction, persists across all possible timelines. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this alternate history demonstrates that the future is not predetermined. Just as Alexander's survival in Babylon could have created a radically different world, choices made today will shape futures we cannot fully predict. We are not passengers in history, but participants, and our actions matter. The roads ahead fork in countless directions, and which path we take depends on decisions we make individually and collectively. As we let this alternate history fade back into the realm of imagination, as we return to our own timeline where Alexander died young and the world developed differently, we carry forward insights from the journey. We understand more deeply how contingent our present is, how much depends on accidents and choices, how individuals and circumstances interact to create historical trajectories. We appreciate both the power and the limits of human agency, the ability of extraordinary individuals to shape history and the constraints they face. And we recognize that, in some sense, we are all Alexander struggling to leave our mark, to create something lasting, to achieve purposes that give our lives meaning. Most of us will not conquer empires or transform civilizations, but we all make choices that ripple outward in ways we cannot fully predict. We all participate in shaping the future, and our actions, however small, contribute to the vast tapestry of human history. The night wind blows across ancient Babylon, across ruins that in both timelines speak of vanished glory. Alexander is gone, in one timeline taken young by fever, in another claimed by age after 3 more decades of achievement. His empire has passed into history, fragmented or transformed, but no longer his to command. Yet his name persists in our timeline as the young conqueror who burned brightest and briefest, in our alternate timeline as the emperor who built as well as conquered, who aged and matured and tried to make his achievements permanent. Which Alexander is greater? The historical figure who died at 32, having conquered the Persian Empire but left no lasting political structure, or the imagined Alexander who lived to 62, who conquered the Mediterranean world, who built institutions and trained successors, who aged from warrior to administrator, but whose empire still eventually fragmented? Perhaps they are equally great, each responding to the circumstances they faced, each achieving the maximum possible in their different timelines. What matters is not comparing these two Alexanders, but understanding what both reveal about history, about human ambition, about the interplay of individual will and historical circumstance. In both timelines, Alexander transformed his world through extraordinary effort and ability. In both, he reached for something beyond what any individual can fully achieve. In both, his legacy is mixed, containing both inspiration and cautionary tales. And in both, he reminds us that history is made by humans, is shaped by choices, and could always have been different. If this journey through alternate history has intrigued you, if contemplating roads not taken has stirred your imagination and deepened your understanding of how contingent our world is, consider subscribing for more explorations of history's mysteries and possibilities. Like this video if you enjoyed traveling through time with me, exploring what might have been if one fever had broken differently in ancient Babylon. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what other alternate history would you like to explore? What other pivotal moments could have turned differently, creating worlds unrecognizable from our own? Perhaps you wonder what would have happened if Rome had never fallen, if the Library of Alexandria had never burned, if the Mongols had conquered Europe, if the Black Death had been more or less deadly, if the Industrial Revolution had occurred in China rather than England. History is full of such crossroads, moments when events could have turned differently and everything that followed would have changed. Each offers opportunities for the kind of thoughtful speculation we have undertaken tonight. Until we meet again in the quiet hours between waking and sleep, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be vivid with all the worlds that might have been. May you carry forward from this journey a deeper appreciation for the contingency of history, the power of individual choices, and the infinite possibilities that exist in the spaces between what was and what might have been. The past is fixed, but our understanding of it evolves, and the future remains unwritten, waiting for the choices we will make. Good night, wherever you are. And remember, in some alternate universe, Alexander lived 30 years longer, and the world became something unimaginably different. In our universe, he died young, and we inherited a different world. But in all universes, humans dream, strive, love, create, and leave their marks on time. That is the constant that transcends all timelines, the fundamental truth of human existence that no accident of history can alter.